there, lovely listeners. Welcome back to our podcast, powered by the amazing folks at Jetoff, AI, who help us spread love and laughter across the globe.
What's up, everyone? I'm Leo, and I'm thrilled to be here with my co-host, the fabulous Mira.
Thanks, Leah. We're back with another exciting episode, and today we're going to compare to incredible countries that will make you go wow in just a few minutes.
That's right, Mira. And before we dive into the juicy stuff, I have to share a funny story from our previous podcast. Remember when Mira accidentally spilled coffee all over her notes?
Oh, Leo, you're bringing that up again. But, yes, it was quite the mess. I had to start all over again. And let me tell you, it was a comedy of errors.
I loved every minute of it. And speaking of comedy, have you guys seen the latest memes on Twitter? I'm dying over here.
Oh, Leo, you and your Twitter obsession. But seriously, our previous podcast was a blast, and we had an amazing conversation about safety and crime rates in different countries.
That's right, Mira. And today, we're going to take it to the next level by comparing to countries that are often misunderstood. So, without further ado, let's introduce our topic of the day, Burundi and Chile.
That's right, Leo. And for those of you who are wondering, why Burundi and Chile? We'll get to that in just a minute. But first, let's talk about why we chose these two countries.
Yes. So, Mira and I were brainstorming, and we thought, why not pick two countries that are often overlooked, but have so much to offer? And that's how Burundi and Chile came to the forefront.
That's right, Leo. And I think what's so exciting about these two countries is that they're both located in different parts of the world, but they have so much in common.
Exactly, Mira. And that's what makes this comparison so fascinating. So, let's get started and answer all your questions about Burundi and Chile.
And don't worry, guys, we'll cover everything from safety and crime rates to education, healthcare, and even the nightlife scene in these two countries.
That's right, Mira. And for all you travelers out there, we'll also talk about the best places to visit, the local cuisine, and even some tips for navigating these countries like a pro.
So, are you guys ready to embark on this amazing journey with us? Let's do this.
That's right, Mira. And remember, we're here to help you make informed decisions about these two incredible countries. So, sit back, relax, and get ready to learn something new.
And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, so you don't miss out on any future episodes.
That's right, Mira. And if you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes, feel free to leave them in the comments below. We love hearing from you.
And before we go, let me just say that we're so grateful to have an amazing community like yours. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.
That's right, Mira. And until next time, stay curious, stay adventurous, and keep on laughing.
All right. Dive into general safety and crime rates in Burundi and Chile. I'm curious. Leo, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Burundi?
Actually, I was expecting a lot of chaos. But Burundi seems to have made some significant strides in reducing crime rates. According to the UN, they've seen a decline in violent crime over the past few years.
That's great to hear. I think one of the reasons for this is the government's focus on community policing. They're really working to build trust between the police and the public, which is essential for reducing crime.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the police. Burundi's also made a concerted effort to address the root causes of crime, like poverty and lack of opportunities. They're investing in education and job training programs, which can really help to prevent crime from happening in the first place.
I completely agree. And it's not just about the government. The people of Burundi are also playing a big role in keeping their communities safe. I've heard that many Burundians are taking matters into their own hands and organizing community watch groups to keep an eye out for suspicious activity.
Wow, That's amazing. And it's not just about safety. It's also about building a sense of community and social cohesion. When people feel like they're part of a larger community, they're more likely to look out for one another and work together to solve problems.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things that sets Burundi apart from other countries in the region. They're really prioritizing community-based solutions to safety and security issues.
That's so cool. And speaking of community-based solutions, I've heard that Chile has also been doing some innovative work in this area. They've established a network of community-based organizations that work together to prevent crime and promote safety.
Yes. Chile's really leading the way when it comes to community-based policing. And it's not just about the organizations themselves. It's also about the way they're working with the police to build trust and cooperation.
Absolutely. And I think one of the key factors in Chile's success is their focus on restorative justice. Instead of just punishing offenders, they're working to address the root causes of their behavior and help them to become positive contributors to society.
That's such a great approach. And it's not just about the offenders. It's also about the victims and their families. Justice really helps to provide a sense of closure and healing for those who've been affected by crime.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things that sets Chile apart from other countries in the region. They're really prioritizing a holistic approach to safety and security, one that takes into account the needs and perspectives of all stakeholders.
I completely agree. And I think our listeners would agree with me that it's really inspiring to see countries like Burundi and Chile prioritizing community-based solutions to safety and security issues.
Absolutely. And I think it's a great reminder that safety and security are not just about law enforcement. They're also about building strong, resilient communities that can work together to prevent crime and promote safety.
Well, as topic, I'm curious. Leo, what do you think our listeners would like to see in terms of community-based solutions to safety and security issues in Burundi and Chile?
I think they'd love to see more investment in education and job training programs, as well as more community-based initiatives that bring people together and promote social cohesion.
That's a great idea. And I think we can all learn from the examples of Burundi and Chile. Thanks for joining me, Leo. And I hope our listeners have enjoyed this topic.
Thanks, Mira. It's been a pleasure.
Tied into the fascinating world of Burundi and Chile, exploring how their unique political systems shape expat life. I'm curious. Leo, what do you think about Burundi's governance?
Burundi, a country with a complex history. Indeed, from my understanding, the president has significant powers, which can be both a blessing and a curse. But I'm sure our listeners living in Burundi would agree with me that the government's efforts to promote peace and unity are commendable.
That's right. Leo! And speaking of unity, I'd love to share a story about a Burundian friend who organized a community event to bring people together from different backgrounds. It was a huge success, and I think it's a great example of how social harmony can be fostered in a country.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this approach to community building. Do you think it's something that could be replicated in other countries? Or is it specific to Burundi's culture?
That's a great question. Leo, I think it's definitely something that could be applied in other countries, but it would require a deep understanding of the local culture and community. And speaking of culture, have you ever tried Burundian cuisine? I'm absolutely obsessed with their spicy dishes.
Yes. I've had my fair share of spicy food in Burundi, and I must say, it's an acquired taste. But I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that trying new foods is a big part of the expat experience. And speaking of new experiences, I'd love to share a story about a friend who moved to Chile and had to adapt to the country's unique political system.
Oh, I'd love to hear that. But first, let me just say that I'm impressed by Chile's commitment to democracy and human rights. It's a country that truly values social harmony and community engagement.
Yes. Chile is a great example of a country that has made significant strides in promoting peace and unity. And speaking of peace and unity, I'd love to share a story about a friend who participated in a community project in Chile that brought together people from different backgrounds to work towards a common goal.
Wow, that That sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about that project. And speaking of projects, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the role of NGOs in promoting social harmony in both Burundi and Chile.
That's a great question. Mira, I think NGOs play a crucial role in promoting social harmony. But it's also important to note that their effectiveness can vary depending on the specific context and community. And speaking of community, have you ever noticed how Burundian and Chilean cultures have a strong emphasis on family and community ties?
Yes. I've definitely noticed that. And I think it's something that's really important for expats to understand when moving to either country. It's not just about adapting to the local culture, but also about building strong relationships with the people around you.
Absolutely. Mira, and speaking of relationships, I'd love to share a story about a friend who moved to Burundi and had to navigate the country's complex social dynamics. It was a real challenge, but ultimately, it led to some amazing relationships and experiences.
Well, that sounds like a really valuable experience. And speaking of valuable experiences, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the importance of learning local languages when moving to a new country. Do you think it's essential for building strong relationships with the local community?
That's a great question. Mira, I think learning local languages is definitely essential for building strong relationships. But it's also important to note that it can be a challenging and time-consuming process. And speaking of challenges, I'd love to share a story about a friend who had to navigate the bureaucratic process in Chile to get her residency permit.
Yes. I've heard horror stories about the bureaucracy in Chile. But I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that it's worth it in the end to get that residency permit. And speaking of permits, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the role of government agencies in promoting social harmony in both Burundi and Chile.
That's a great question. Mira, I think government agencies play a crucial role in promoting social harmony. But it's also important to note that their effectiveness can vary depending on the specific context and community. And speaking of community, have you ever noticed how Burundian and Chilean cultures have a strong emphasis on community service and volunteer work?
Yes. I've definitely noticed that. And I think it's something that's really important for expats to understand when moving to either country. It's not just about adapting to the local culture, but also about giving back to the community.
Absolutely. Mira, and speaking of giving back, I'd love to share a story about a friend who started a community project in Chile that aimed to promote social harmony and community engagement.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about that project. And speaking of projects, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the role of technology in promoting social harmony in both Burundi and Chile. Do you think it's a valuable tool for building strong relationships and communities?
That's a great question. Mira, I think technology can be a valuable tool. But it's also important to note that it's not a replacement for human connection and community engagement. And speaking of human connection, have you ever noticed how Burundian and Chilean cultures have a strong emphasis on hospitality and welcoming guests?
Yes. I've definitely noticed that. And I think it's something that's really important for expats to understand when moving to either country. It's not just about adapting to the local culture, but also about being a good guest and building strong relationships with the people around you.
Absolutely. Mira, and speaking of relationships, I'd love to share a story about a friend who moved to Burundi and had to navigate the country's complex social dynamics. It was a real challenge, but ultimately, it led to some amazing relationships and experiences.
Wow, that sounds like a really valuable experience. And speaking of valuable experiences, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the importance of learning local customs and traditions when moving to a new country. Do you think it's essential for building strong relationships with the local community?
That's a great question. Mira, I think learning local customs and traditions is definitely essential. But it's also important to note that it can be a challenging and time-consuming process. And speaking of challenges, I'd love to share a story about a friend who had to navigate the bureaucratic process in Chile to get her residency permit.
Yes. I've heard. When it comes to economic conditions and cost of living, I think our listeners would love to know more about Burundi and Chile. Both countries have unique characteristics that make them appealing to expats. Let's dive in and explore how they compare.
That's right. Mira, Burundi, a small country in East Africa, and Chile, a country in South America, have different economies and cost of living. I'm curious to see how they stack up. Burundi's economy is primarily driven by agriculture, while Chile's is more diversified, with a strong focus on mining, manufacturing, and services.
Exactly. And that's reflected in their cost of living. Burundi is one of the poorest countries in the world. And as a result, the cost of living is relatively low. However, the standard of living is also quite low, which can be challenging for expats. On the other hand, Chile has a higher cost of living, but still relatively affordable compared to other developed countries.
I agree. And it's worth noting that Chile has a well-developed infrastructure, which makes it easier for expats to get around and access amenities. Burundi, on the other hand, has a more limited infrastructure, which can make it harder for expats to navigate.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think our listeners would love to know more about the job market in both countries. What are the typical salaries like in Burundi and Chile? And what kind of work opportunities are available for expats?
Great question. Mira, in Burundi, the typical salary is relatively low, around $200, $300 per month. However, expats can earn significantly more, up to $1, $500 per month, depending on their profession and experience. In Chile, the typical salary is higher, around $500 one. So I think that we can copy that. But expats can earn up to $2.03. So I think that we can copy that. 0 per month.
Wow, that's a big difference. And I think it's worth noting that Chile has a more developed economy, which means there are more job opportunities available for expats. The competition can be fierce, especially in certain industries like finance and technology.
That's right, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that Burundi has a growing economy, but it's still largely driven by agriculture. This can make it harder for expats to find work outside of the agricultural sector.
I see what you mean. And I think our listeners would love to know more about the cost of living in both countries. What are the typical prices for housing, food, and transportation in Burundi and Chile?
Great question. Mira, in Burundi, the cost of living is relatively low, but the quality of housing and food can be variable. A one-bedroom apartment in the city center can cost around $100, $200 per month, while a meal at a mid-range restaurant can cost around $5.10. In Chile, the cost of living is higher, but the quality of housing and food is generally better. A one-bedroom apartment in the city center can cost around $300, $500 per month, while a meal at a mid-range restaurant can cost around $10.20.
Well, that's a big difference. And I think it's worth noting that Chile has a more developed tourism industry, which can make it easier for expats to find affordable housing and transportation.
That's right, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that Burundi has a more limited tourism industry, which can make it harder for expats to find affordable housing and transportation.
I see what you mean. And I think our listeners would love to know more about the social safety net in both countries. What kind of healthcare and education services are available to expats in Burundi and Chile?
Great question. Mira, in Burundi, the healthcare system is relatively basic, and expats may need to rely on private healthcare services. However, the education system is generally good, and expats can access quality schools and universities. In Chile, the healthcare system is more developed, and expats can access quality healthcare services. However, the education system can be challenging, especially for expats who don't speak Spanish.
Wow, that's a big difference. And I think it's worth noting that Chile has a more developed social safety net, which can make it easier for expats to access healthcare and education services.
That's right, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that Burundi has a more limited social safety net, which can make it harder for expats to access healthcare and education services.
I see what you mean. And I think our listeners would love to know more about the job market in both countries. What are the typical salaries like in Burundi and Chile? And what kind of work opportunities are available for expats?
Oh, great question. Mira, in Burundi, the typical salary is relatively low, around $200, $300 per month. However, expats can earn significantly more, up to $1. So, I think that we can cover that. $500 per month, depending on their profession and experience. In Chile, the typical salary is higher, around $500 one. So I think that we can cover that, $0 per month. But expats can earn up to $2, $0 per month.
Wow, that's a big difference. And I think it's worth noting that Chile has a more developed economy, which means there are more job opportunities available for expats. However, the competition can be fierce, especially in certain industries like finance and technology.
That's right, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that Burundi has a growing economy, but it's still largely driven by agriculture. This can make it harder for expats to find work outside of the agricultural sector.
I see what you mean. And I think our listeners would love to know more about the cost of living in both countries. What are the typical prices for housing, food, and transportation in Burundi and Chile?
Great question. Mira, in Burundi, the cost of living is relatively low, but the quality of housing and food can be variable. A one-bedroom apartment in the city center can cost around $100 to $200 per month, while a meal at a mid-range restaurant can cost around $5.10. In Chile, the cost of living is higher, but the quality of housing and food is generally better. A one-bedroom apartment in the city center can cost around $300, $500 per month, while a meal at a mid-range restaurant can cost around $10.20.
Wow, that's a big difference. And I think it's worth noting that Chile has a more developed tourism industry, which can make it easier for expats to find affordable housing and transportation.
That's right, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that Burundi has a more limited tourism industry, which can make it harder for expats to find affordable housing and transportation.
I'm so to dive into accommodation options and quality in Burundi and Chile. Both countries have a unique charm. But I'm curious, Leo, have you ever stayed in a Burundian homestay?
Actually, Mira, I have, and it was an unforgettable experience. The locals were so warm and welcoming, and the food was incredible. But I have to say, the accommodation was a bit rustic.
Rustic is one way to put it, but I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about it. So, what was it like staying with a Burundian family?
Well, it was like being part of the family. They showed me around, introduced me to their friends, and even taught me some of their traditional dances. The accommodation, however, was a different story.
I'm sure it was. But, in all seriousness, I've heard that Burundi has a growing expat community, and many of them are looking for comfortable and affordable accommodation options. Have you heard anything about that? Leo?
Yes, I have. From what I've gathered, there are some great options for expats in Burundi, especially in Bujumbura. But, I have to say, the prices can be a bit steep for some people.
I see what you mean. But, I'm curious. Have you ever stayed in a Chilean hostel? I've heard they're some of the best in the world.
Yes, I have stayed in a few Chilean hostels, and they're indeed amazing. The staff is so friendly, and the facilities are top-notch. But, I have to say, the prices can be a bit high for budget travelers.
I understand what you mean. But, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the accommodation options in Chile. So, what do you think is the best way to find a great hostel or hotel in Chile?
Well, I think the best way is to read reviews and do some research beforehand. But I also think it's a good idea to ask locals for recommendations. They know the best places to stay, and they can give you some great insider tips.
That's a great idea. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would agree with you. So, what do you think is the biggest difference between accommodation options in Burundi and Chile?
That's a tough one. But I think one of the biggest differences is the price. Burundi can be a bit more affordable, but Chile has some amazing luxury options that are worth every penny.
I see what you mean. But, I'm curious, have you ever stayed in a luxurious hotel in Chile? I've heard they're some of the best in the world.
Yes, I have stayed in a few luxurious hotels in Chile, and they're indeed amazing. The service is top-notch, and the facilities are incredible. But I have to say, the prices can be a bit steep for some people.
I understand what you mean. But I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the luxurious options in Chile. So, what do you think is the best way to find a great hotel in Chile?
Well, I think that we can counter that. I think the best way is to do some research beforehand and read reviews. But I also think it's a good idea to ask locals for recommendations. They know the best places to stay, and they can give you some great insider tips.
That's a great idea. Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with you. So, what do you think is the most important thing to consider when looking for accommodation in Burundi and Chile?
That's a tough one. But I think one of the most important things to consider is the location. You want to be close to the city center, but also have easy access to public transportation.
That's a great point. Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with you. So, what do you think is the best way to experience the local culture in Burundi and Chile?
Well, I think one of the best ways is to stay with a local family or in a homestay. It's a great way to learn about the culture and meet new people.
I see what you mean. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the local culture in Burundi and Chile. So what do you think is the most interesting thing about the local culture in these two countries?
That's a tough one. But I think one of the most interesting things is the traditional music and dance in Burundi. It's so unique and fascinating.
I see what you mean. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with you. So what do you think is the best way to experience the traditional music and dance in Burundi?
Well, I think one of the best ways is to attend a local festival or event. It's a great way to experience the culture and meet new people.
That's a great idea. Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with you. So, what do you think is the most important thing to remember when traveling to Burundi and Chile?
That's a tough one. But I think one of the most important things to remember is to be respectful of the local culture and customs.
I see what you mean. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with you. So, what do you think is the best way to be respectful of the local culture and customs in Burundi and Chile?
Well, I think one of the best ways is to do some research beforehand and learn about the local customs and traditions. But I also think it's a good idea to ask locals for advice and guidance.
That's a great idea. Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with you. So, what do you think is the biggest advantage of staying in Burundi and Chile?
That's a tough one. But I think one of the biggest advantages is the opportunity to experience a unique and authentic culture.
I see what you mean. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with you. So what do you think is the biggest disadvantage of staying in Burundi and Chile?
That's a tough one. But I think one of the biggest disadvantages is the limited availability of luxury accommodation options.
I understand what you mean. But I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the accommodation options in these two countries. So, what do you think is the best way to find a great accommodation option in Burundi and Chile?
Well, I think the best way is to read reviews and do some research beforehand. But I also think it's a good idea to ask locals for recommendations.
That's a great idea. Leo. And so, let's talk about Burundi and Chile when it comes to visa, immigration, and official procedures. From my research, Burundi seems to have a pretty straightforward process for tourists, but it can get a bit complicated for long-term stays or work visas.
That's true. Yeah, I've heard that Burundi's tourism industry is growing, and they're trying to make it easier for visitors to get a visa. But, as you said, it can be a bit of a challenge for expats who want to stay longer or work in the country.
Exactly. And I'm curious. Leo, have you ever had to deal with the Burundian immigration system firsthand? Did you find it to be relatively smooth sailing or a bit of a headache?
Well, I wouldn't say it was a headache, but it was definitely an adventure. I had to navigate the process of getting a work visa, and it took a few months to get everything sorted out. But, in the end, it was worth it.
Well, that's a great story. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about your experiences. Speaking of which, have you heard about Chile's immigration system? I've heard it's quite streamlined and efficient.
Ah, yes. Chile's system is definitely one of the most user-friendly I've come across. They have a very clear and transparent process for getting a visa, and the paperwork is relatively minimal.
That's great to hear. I've been looking into Chile's process for getting a residence visa, and it seems like it's a bit more straightforward than Burundi's. But I'm sure there are still some challenges to overcome.
Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest challenges in both countries is the language barrier. If you don't speak the local language, it can be difficult to navigate the immigration system.
That's a great point. Leo, language can definitely be a barrier. But I've heard that Chile has a lot of resources available for foreigners who want to learn Spanish. Maybe we can even do a follow-up episode on language learning in Chile?
That's a great idea. Mira, I'd love to hear more about Chile's language learning resources. And, in the meantime, I think it's worth noting that Burundi also has some great resources available for foreigners who want to learn Kirundi.
That's a great point. Leo, I didn't know that Burundi had language learning resources available. Maybe we can even explore some of those resources in a future episode.
Sounds like a plan. Mira, and in the meantime, I think it's worth noting that both Burundi and Chile have some great online resources available for foreigners who want to learn more about the immigration process.
Exactly. And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any tips or advice we can offer on navigating the visa and immigration process in both countries. Maybe we can even do a Q&A session in a future episode?
That's a great idea. Mira, I'd love to help answer some of our listeners' questions about the immigration process in Burundi and Chile.
Well, I think that's all for now. Folks, thanks for tuning into our discussion on visa, immigration, and official procedures in Burundi and Chile. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to share them in the comments section below.
And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more episodes on expat life and travel in Burundi and Chile.
So, let's talk about healthcare in Burundi and Chile. I'm curious to know. Leo, how do you think the healthcare systems in these two countries compare?
Well, Mira, I've done some research, and it seems that Burundi's healthcare system is quite limited, especially in rural areas. On the other hand, Chile has a well-developed healthcare system, with a strong focus on universal access and quality care.
That's a great point. Leo, I've heard that Chile has a public healthcare system that's considered one of the best in Latin America. But what about Burundi? I read that they have a shortage of healthcare professionals and medical facilities.
Exactly, Mira. And it's not just a matter of numbers. The quality of care in Burundi is also a concern. I've heard that many hospitals and clinics lack basic equipment and supplies, which can lead to poor outcomes for patients.
I see what you mean. And I'm sure our listeners living in Burundi would agree with me that healthcare can be a major challenge. But what about Chile? I've heard that they have a strong focus on preventive care and public health initiatives.
Yes, that's true. Chile has a well-organized system for preventing and controlling diseases. And they also have a strong network of community health workers who provide primary care services to rural communities.
That's great to hear. Leo, and I'm curious to know, have you ever had to deal with the healthcare system in Burundi or Chile?
Actually, Mira, I did have to visit a hospital in Chile once, and I was impressed by the quality of care and the efficiency of the system. But I've also heard that the healthcare system in Burundi can be quite challenging for foreigners.
I see what you mean. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that navigating a foreign healthcare system can be daunting. But what about cultural differences? How do you think the cultural context affects healthcare in these two countries?
Well, Mira, I think cultural differences play a significant role in shaping healthcare systems. For example, in Burundi, traditional healing practices are still widely practiced, and many people rely on herbal remedies and spiritual healers.
That's fascinating. Leo. And I've heard that Chile also has a strong focus on traditional medicine, but in a more integrated way with Western medicine.
Exactly, Mira. And I think that's one of the strengths of Chile's healthcare system, its ability to balance traditional and modern approaches to health.
I see what you mean. And I'm curious to know, what do you think are the biggest challenges facing the healthcare systems in Burundi and Chile?
Well, Mira, I think one of the biggest challenges in Burundi is the shortage of healthcare professionals and medical facilities. And in Chile, I think one of the biggest challenges is the growing inequality in access to healthcare services.
That's a great point, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that healthcare access and quality are critical issues in both countries.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think it's essential to recognize the efforts being made by governments, healthcare providers, and communities to improve healthcare access and quality in both countries.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the insight into the healthcare systems in Burundi and Chile.
Agreed, Mira. And if you have any thoughts or experiences related to healthcare in these countries, please share them with us in the comments.
And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more content on healthcare and other topics.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Alright, let's dive into transportation, infrastructure and convenience in Burundi and Chile. Starting with Burundi, I found that public transportation is mainly limited to buses and taxis.
That's true, Mira. But what's interesting is that Burundi has been working on improving its road network. They're focusing on building new roads and upgrading existing ones to reduce travel times and improve safety.
Exactly, Leo. And it's crucial to note that Burundi's geography is quite mountainous, making road construction a significant challenge.
I bet our listeners in Burundi can relate to the struggles of navigating those mountainous roads.
Indeed, they can. Now, let's talk about Chile. Chile has a well-developed public transportation system with an extensive network of buses, trains, and metro lines.
That's right, Mia. And Chile's public transportation is also relatively affordable, making it accessible to a wide range of people.
Affordability is key, especially for low-income households. I found that Chile's metro system is one of the most efficient in South America.
Efficient is an understatement. Mira, Chile's metro system is a marvel of modern engineering.
I'm glad you agree. Leo, Burundi, on the other hand, has a more limited public transportation network, with many residents relying on private vehicles or walking.
That's a great point. Yeah. Burundi's private transportation sector is quite vibrant, with many taxi companies operating in the country.
And it's worth noting that Burundi has a relatively low car ownership rate compared to Chile.
That's true, Mira. But it's also worth noting that Burundi's public transportation system is slowly improving, with the introduction of new bus companies and improved road maintenance.
Improvement is key, and it's heartening to see Burundi taking steps to upgrade its transportation infrastructure.
Absolutely. Mira, now, let's talk about transportation convenience. I found that Chile has a well-developed network of bike lanes and pedestrian paths, making it easy for residents to get around on foot or by bike.
That's a great point. Leo, Chile's commitment to sustainable transportation is admirable. I bet our listeners in Chile can relate to the convenience of having bike lanes and pedestrian paths.
Indeed, they can.
Now, let's compare the two countries. Burundi's transportation infrastructure is more limited, but it's slowly improving.
That's right, Mira. And while Burundi's public transportation system is limited, it's also relatively affordable.
Affordability is crucial, especially for low-income households.
I completely agree. Mira,
So what do you all think about the transportation options in Burundi and Chile? Do you have any favorite transportation hacks or tips to share?
well, I do have a few tips to share. If you're traveling in Burundi, be sure to try the local bus companies. And if you're in Chile, take advantage of the metro system.
Great advice. Leo? And don't forget to try the local cuisine while you're at it.
Good point. Mira,
Alright, let's wrap up this topic. Transportation infrastructure and convenience are crucial for any country's development.
absolutely. Mira. And while Burundi's transportation infrastructure is more limited, it's slowly improving.
That's right. Leo. And Chile's commitment to sustainable transportation is a great example for other countries to follow. I'm curious to know, Leo, how do you think language barriers affect tourists and expats in Burundi and Chile?
Great question. Mira, from what I've researched, Burundi is three official languages: Kirundi, French, and... But, in reality, most people speak Kirundi, which can be a challenge for tourists who don't speak the language.
Exactly. And Chile, on the other hand, has a much more complex linguistic landscape. They have 11 official languages, including Spanish, Mapudungun, Quechua, and Aymara. But Spanish is the dominant language, and many Chileans speak it fluently.
That's right. And I've heard that Chileans are very proud of their language and culture. But what about language learning resources? Mira, are there any programs or schools that can help expats learn the local language?
Actually, Leo, I've looked into it. And there are several language schools and programs in both Burundi and Chile that offer language classes for expats. But it's worth noting that learning a local language can be a challenging and time-consuming process.
I completely agree, but it's so worth it. Mira, not only can it help you connect with the local community, but it can also give you a deeper understanding of the culture and customs. And let's be real, it's also a great way to impress the locals with your language skills.
Well, I'm sure that's true. Leo! But what about language barriers in everyday life? Like shopping and getting around? Do tourists and expats in Burundi and Chile face any challenges when communicating with locals?
Yes. In Burundi, for example, many shopkeepers and vendors may not speak English or French, so tourists may need to rely on hand gestures or translation apps to communicate. And in Chile, while many Chileans speak Spanish, some may use local slang or dialects that can be difficult for foreigners to understand.
That's a great point. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners can relate to the challenges of communicating in a foreign language. Have you ever been in a situation where you didn't speak the language, and you had to rely on gestures or translation apps to get by?
Oh, yeah. I once tried to order food at a restaurant in Japan, and I ended up using a combination of hand gestures and broken Japanese to get what I wanted. It was a bit embarrassing, but it worked.
Well, I'm sure that's a funny story. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about your language learning adventures. Maybe you can share some tips or resources for learning a new language?
Sure thing. Mira, one of my favorite language learning resources is the app Duolingo. It's a great way to learn the basics of a new language, and it's free.
That's a great tip. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the recommendation. What about language and culture? Leo, how do you think language reflects the cultural values and customs of a country?
That's a great question. Mira, language can be a powerful tool for conveying cultural values and customs. For example, in Burundi, the language is often used to express respect and politeness, while in Chile, the language is often used to express creativity and humor.
I completely agree. Leo, and I think that's one of the reasons why language learning is so important. Not only can it help you communicate with locals, but give you a deeper understanding of the culture and customs.
Exactly. And I think that's why language learning is such a valuable skill for expats and tourists. It can help you navigate everyday life, but it can also give you a deeper appreciation for the local culture and customs.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. Leo, but before we go, I want to ask our listeners, have you ever had any experiences with language barriers while traveling or living abroad? Share your stories with us in the comments below.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more language-related content and cultural insights.
I'm fascinated by the unique blend of cultures in Burundi and Chile. Both countries have a rich tapestry of traditions, but I'd love to explore how they approach cultural diversity and tolerance.
Ah, great point. Mira, Burundi, with its history of colonialism and ethnic divisions, has made significant strides in promoting unity and reconciliation. Their national motto, Yubamwe, Amirimo, and Yubeanzire, or unity, work, progress, reflects their commitment to building a harmonious society.
That's so true. Leo, and Chile, with its indigenous Mapuche people, has a long history of cultural exchange and coexistence. Their concept of Chilean identity or Chilean identity, which celebrates the country's diverse heritage, is a beautiful example of tolerance in action.
Exactly. And both countries have made efforts to preserve their traditional music, dance, and art forms. In Burundi, the drums of the royal court are a symbol of cultural heritage, while in Chile, the Mapuche people's traditional dances, like the komite, are an important part of their identity.
I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the key to promoting cultural diversity and tolerance in these countries? Is it the government's initiatives? Or is it the people themselves who are driving this change?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, I think it's a combination of both. The governments in both countries have implemented policies and programs to promote unity and reconciliation. But it's also the people who are taking the initiative to educate themselves and others about the importance of cultural diversity and tolerance.
That's so inspiring. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the people behind these initiatives. Perhaps we could share some personal stories of individuals who are working tirelessly to promote cultural diversity and tolerance in their communities.
Absolutely. Mira, I have a friend who works with a community organization in Burundi that's dedicated to promoting cultural exchange and understanding. They're doing some amazing work, and I'd love to share their story with our listeners.
That sounds fantastic. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the challenges and successes of this initiative. Perhaps we could also explore how the government and international organizations are supporting these efforts.
Ah, great idea. Mira, the government in Burundi has established a national commission to promote cultural diversity and tolerance. And they're working closely with international organizations like the United Nations to support their efforts.
I'm impressed by the level of commitment and cooperation between the government and international organizations. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the impact of these initiatives on the ground.
Ah, yes. I have some amazing stories to share about the impact of these initiatives on the lives of ordinary people in Burundi and Chile. They're truly inspiring, and I think our listeners will find them fascinating.
Wonderful. Leah, I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear more about the cultural diversity and tolerance initiatives in Burundi and Chile. Let's get started.
And I'm sure our listeners will agree with me when I say that cultural diversity and tolerance are essential for building a harmonious and prosperous society. But what do our listeners think? Do they have any stories or experiences to share about cultural diversity and tolerance in these countries?
Great question. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners will be happy to share their thoughts and experiences in the comment section. But before we go, let's summarize what we've discussed so far.
Great idea. Mira. So, to recap, we've talked about the cultural diversity and tolerance initiatives in Burundi and Chile, and how they're promoting unity and reconciliation in their societies. We've also heard some amazing personal stories and examples of individuals who are working tirelessly to promote cultural diversity and tolerance in their communities.
That's a great summary. And I'm sure our listeners will find it informative and inspiring. Thanks for sharing your insights and experiences with us today.
The pleasure is mine. Mira, And I'm sure our listeners will agree with me when I say that cultural diversity and tolerance are essential for building a better world. Until next time, stay curious and keep laughing.
I'm curious about Burundi's educational system. From what I've researched, it seems that education is highly valued in Burundian culture, with a strong emphasis on traditional values and community involvement.
Ah, that's fascinating. I've heard that Burundi has a unique approach to education, with a focus on practical skills and hands-on learning.
Exactly. And I've also read that the country has made significant strides in increasing access to education, particularly for girls and women.
That's great to hear. Burundi's commitment to education is definitely inspiring.
But I'm also interested in comparing Burundi's educational system to Chile's.
Ah, Chile has a very different approach to education, with a strong emphasis on academic rigor and standardized testing.
Yes, that's what I've heard. And I'm curious to know more about how Chile's education system supports language acquisition.
Well, Chile has a well-established language program that provides opportunities for students to learn English and other languages.
That's great to hear. I've also read that Chile has a strong tradition of education and has made significant investments in its education system.
Yes, Chile has a highly developed education system, with a strong focus on academic achievement and research.
I'm curious to know more about the language requirements for students in Chile.
In Chile, students typically need to demonstrate proficiency in Spanish, as well as English, to gain admission to university.
That makes sense. And I've also read that Chile has a number of language schools and programs that provide opportunities for students to learn English and other languages.
Yes, that's true. Chile has a number of language schools and programs that cater to students of all ages and levels.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's more challenging to learn a language in Burundi or Chile?
Well, I think it's a tough question. But I'd say that Burundi's unique cultural context and emphasis on practical skills might make it more challenging to learn a language in Burundi.
That's an interesting point. And I think it's also worth noting that Burundi's education system is still evolving, with a focus on improving access to education and increasing academic achievement.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that Chile's education system is highly developed, with a strong focus on academic achievement and research.
I'm curious to know more about the role of technology in Burundi's education system.
Technology is playing an increasingly important role in Burundi's education system, with a focus on online learning and digital resources.
That's great to hear. And I think it's also worth noting that Burundi's education system is still facing challenges, particularly in terms of access to resources and infrastructure.
Yes, that's true. But I think it's also worth noting that Chile's education system is highly developed, with a strong focus on academic achievement and research.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think technology is a key factor in improving access to education in Burundi?
Well, I think it's definitely a factor. But I also think that there are other important factors, such as access to resources and infrastructure.
That's a great point. And I think it's also worth noting that Burundi's education system is highly valued in the community, with a strong emphasis on traditional values and community involvement.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that Chile's education system is highly developed, with a strong focus on academic achievement and research.
I'm curious to know more about the role of community involvement in Burundi's education system.
Community involvement is a key factor in Burundi's education system, with a focus on partnerships between schools, communities, and local organizations.
That's great to hear. And I think it's also worth noting that Burundi's education system is still evolving, with a focus on improving access to education and increasing academic achievement.
Yes, that's true. But I think it's also worth noting that Chile's education system is highly developed, with a strong focus on academic achievement and research.
So, let's talk about Burundi and Chile, two countries with vastly different climates. I'm curious to know, Leo, how you think the climate in Burundi affects the daily lives of its citizens?
Great question. Nira, Burundi's climate is often described as tropical, with high temperatures and high humidity levels throughout the year. I'm sure our listeners living in Burundi would agree that the heat and humidity can be quite oppressive at times.
Absolutely. And it's not just the temperature that's a concern, but also the fact that Burundi is prone to droughts and floods. I've heard that the country's water resources are limited, which can have a significant impact on agriculture and food security.
That's right. Mira, and it's not just the environmental impact that's a concern, but also the social and economic implications. In Burundi, the climate can affect people's livelihoods, particularly in rural areas where agriculture is a major source of income.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think the climate in Burundi is a major challenge for the country's development? Or is it more of a minor issue?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. Mira, the climate can certainly be a challenge, but it's not the only factor at play. I'm sure our listeners would agree that the country's politics and economy also play a significant role in shaping the daily lives of its citizens.
That's a great point. Leo, and speaking of politics, I've heard that Burundi has a complex history when it comes to its climate. The country has experienced several severe droughts and floods in recent years, which has had a significant impact on its economy and infrastructure.
Ah, yes. The climate in Burundi is indeed a complex issue. Mira, and it's not just the country's climate that's a concern, but also the fact that it's located in a region that's prone to natural disasters.
That's right. And it's not just Burundi that's affected by the climate, but also other countries in the region, including Chile. I'm curious to know, Leo, how Chile's climate compares to Burundi's.
Well, Mira, Chile's climate is quite different from Burundi's. Chile is a long, thin country that stretches from the Andes Mountains to the Pacific Ocean, and its climate varies greatly depending on the region. In the north, the climate is arid and dry, while in the south, it's temperate and humid.
Oh, I see. Chile has a more varied climate than Burundi, which is more tropical. And I've heard that Chile is also prone to natural disasters, such as earthquakes and tsunamis.
That's right. Mira, Chile is indeed prone to natural disasters, particularly earthquakes and tsunamis. The country's unique geography, with the Andes Mountains running along its eastern border and the Pacific Ocean to the west, makes it vulnerable to these types of disasters.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Chile would agree that the country's geography is a major factor in its climate and natural disasters. And speaking of geography, I've heard that Chile has some of the most unique and beautiful landscapes in the world, including the Atacama Desert and Easter Island.
Ah, yes. Chile's geography is indeed unique and beautiful. Mira, and it's not just the country's landscapes that are notable, but also its climate. Chile's climate is known for its mild winters and cool summers, making it a popular destination for tourists.
That's right, Leo. And I've heard that Chile is also a leader in renewable energy, particularly solar and wind power. Is that true?
Yes, that's true. Mira, Chile has made significant investments in renewable energy, particularly solar and wind power. The country aims to become carbon neutral by 2050, and it's well on its way to achieving that goal.
Ah, I see. So, Chile is taking a proactive approach to addressing its climate challenges, unlike some other countries. And speaking of proactive approaches, I've heard that Burundi is also taking steps to address its climate challenges.
Ah, yes. Burundi is indeed taking steps to address its climate challenges. Mira, the country has implemented several initiatives to reduce its carbon footprint and promote sustainable agriculture.
That's great to hear, Leo. And I'm curious to know, what do you think are some of the key takeaways from our discussion on Burundi and Chile's climate and seasonal conditions?
Well, Mira, I think one key takeaway is that climate is a complex issue that affects many different aspects of life, including politics, economy, and culture. Another key takeaway is that different countries have different approaches to addressing their climate challenges, and what works for one country may not work for another.
Oh, I see. And finally, I'm curious to know, What do you think our listeners can take away from our discussion on climate and seasonal conditions in Burundi and Chile?
Well, Mira, I think our listeners can take away the importance of understanding and addressing climate challenges in order to promote sustainable development and reduce the risk of natural disasters. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that climate is a critical issue that affects us all, regardless of where we live.
When it comes to food culture and nutritional alternatives, Burundi and Chile are two countries that offer a fascinating culinary landscape. Burundi, with its African heritage, showcases a rich diversity of traditional dishes, from the spices to cold damu sima to the flavorful rice and bean dish called damu sima nokandi.
That's right, Mira. And Chile, with its Spanish and indigenous influences, boasts a unique blend of flavors and cuisines, from the classic pastel de choclo to the hearty locos.
I'm curious, Leo, how do you think the food culture in Burundi compares to Chile? Do you think the emphasis on traditional dishes is more pronounced in Burundi?
That's a great question. Mira, I think Burundi's emphasis on traditional dishes is indeed more pronounced. But Chile's cuisine has a unique blend of European and indigenous flavors that makes it stand out.
That's an interesting point. I've heard that Chilean cuisine is heavily influenced by Spanish and Italian cuisine, with a strong emphasis on meat and seafood.
Exactly. And Chileans love their meat, particularly beef and pork. But Burundi's cuisine, on the other hand, is more focused on plant-based ingredients, with the emphasis on starchy foods like cassava and plantains.
That's fascinating. I'm certain that our listeners living in Burundi would agree with me that the local cuisine is a staple of the country's culture.
Absolutely. And Chileans would agree that their asado, or barbecue, is an essential part of their cultural heritage.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the role of food in their culture. Do they think it's a way to bring people together? Or is it more of a personal experience?
Great question. Mira, I think food plays a significant role in bringing people together in both Burundi and Chile. Whether it's a traditional dish or a modern fusion cuisine, food has the power to unite people across cultures and borders.
That's so true. And I think it's also interesting to note that both Burundi and Chile have a strong tradition of communal eating, whether it's around a table or in a street food market.
Yes, and that's where the social aspect of food culture comes in. In Burundi, for example, communal eating is a way to show respect and hospitality to guests.
Exactly. And in Chile, communal eating is often associated with family gatherings and special occasions.
I see what you mean. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on local ingredients and seasonal produce.
That's right. And I think that's where the concept of farm-to-table cuisine comes in. Both Burundi and Chile have a rich tradition of using local ingredients and supporting local farmers.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that our listeners can appreciate, especially those who are interested in sustainable living and environmentally friendly food options.
Great point. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong tradition of food preservation and preparation, whether it's through smoking, drying, or fermenting.
Yes, and that's where the concept of omitsima comes in, which is a traditional Burundian dish made from fermented cassava leaves.
I see what you mean. And in Chile, there's a similar tradition of preserving food through pickling and smoking.
Exactly. And I think that's something that our listeners can appreciate, especially those who are interested in traditional cooking techniques.
Great point, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on traditional medicine and the use of local herbs and plants for health and wellness.
Yes, and that's where the concept of natural remedies comes in, which is a key part of traditional Burundian and Chilean medicine.
I see what you mean. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong tradition of communal food festivals and celebrations.
Yes, and that's where the concept of food as a way to bring people together comes in, which is a key part of both Burundian and Chilean culture.
Great point. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on food security and sustainable agriculture.
Yes, And that's where the concept of locally sourced food comes in, which is a key part of both Burundian and Chilean cuisine.
Ah, I see what you mean. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong tradition of food and music, with many traditional dishes being served at social gatherings and celebrations.
Yes, and that's where the concept of food as a way to express culture comes in, which is a key part of both Burundian and Chilean culture.
Ah, great point. Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on food and tradition, with many traditional dishes being passed down through generations.
Yes, and that's where the concept of food as a way to connect with the past comes in, which is a key part of both Burundian and Chilean culture.
Ah, I see what you mean. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong tradition of food and community, with many traditional dishes being served at social gatherings and celebrations.
Yes, and that's where the concept of food as a way to bring people together comes in, which is a key part of both Burundian and Chilean culture.
Ah, great point. Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on food and nutrition, with many traditional dishes being rich in nutrients and healthy ingredients.
Yes, and that's where the concept of nutrition as a key aspect of food culture comes in, which is a key part of both Burundian and Chilean cuisine.
Ah, I see what you mean. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong tradition of food and tradition, with many traditional dishes being passed down through generations.
Yes, and that's where the concept of food as a way to connect with the past comes in, which is a key part of both Burundian and Chilean culture.
Ah, great point. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on food and community, with many traditional dishes being served at social gatherings and celebrations.
Yes, and that's where the concept of food as a way to bring people together comes in, which is a key part of both Burundian and Chilean culture.
Ah, I see what you mean. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong, and so to share with you the rich historical, cultural, and artistic values of Burundi and Chile. Both countries have a unique blend of traditional and modern influences that make them fascinating to explore. Chito, I loves uncovering stories like this. And so do we.
That's right, Mira. And speaking of stories, let's start with Burundi. This tiny East African country has a history that dates back to the 14th century, with a mix of colonial and indigenous influences. Can you imagine the kind of cultural fusion that must have happened?
Exactly. And that's what makes Burundi's cultural heritage so rich. From the traditional dance performances to the vibrant music scene, there's always something to discover. I'm certain that our listeners living in this country would agree with me that the Burundian culture is a true gem.
I agree. Mira, and have you ever heard of the Burundian drums? They're an integral part of the country's traditional music and are said to have healing properties.
That's fascinating. And speaking of healing properties, I've heard that the Chilean Mapuche people have a similar tradition of using music and dance to promote healing and spiritual growth.
Ah, yes. The Mapuche people are known for their beautiful handicrafts and textiles, which are often used in traditional ceremonies. And have you heard about the Chilean wine region? Mendoza? It's one of the most famous wine-producing regions in the world.
Wow, that's impressive. And I've heard that the Burundian coffee is some of the best in the world. Who knew that these two countries had such a strong connection to coffee and wine?
Well, I guess you could say that Burundi and Chile have a lot in common when it comes to their love of good food and drink. But what about their artistic scenes? How do they compare?
Ah, that's a great question. Both countries have a thriving art scene, with a mix of traditional and modern influences. I've heard that the Chilean capital has a vibrant street art scene, with many murals and graffiti adorning the city's walls.
That's true, Nira. And I've heard that the Burundian capital, Bujumbura, has a similar street art scene, with many young artists creating vibrant murals and graffiti.
Exactly. And I think that's what's so great about both countries, their willingness to experiment and push the boundaries of art and culture. Cheers off. I loves featuring stories like this, and I'm sure our listeners will too.
Absolutely. Mira. And speaking of experimentation, have you heard about the Chilean avant-garde music scene? It's known for its experimental and innovative approach to music.
Well, that sounds amazing. And I've heard that the Burundian music scene is also known for its innovative and experimental approach, with many young musicians blending traditional styles with modern influences.
That's right, Mira. And I think that's what makes both countries so exciting to explore their willingness to take risks and push the boundaries of art and culture.
I completely agree, Leo. And I think that's what makes this criterion so fascinating, the way that both countries have taken their unique cultural heritage and used it to create something entirely new and innovative. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this criterion. Mira, I'm curious, what do you think is the biggest difference between Burundi and Chile's cultural scenes?
That's a great question. Leo, I think one of the biggest differences is the way that both countries approach traditional music and dance. While Burundi's traditional music and dance are deeply rooted in its history and culture, Chile's traditional music and dance have been influenced by a variety of cultural and economic factors.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think that's what makes both countries so fascinating to explore, their unique cultural contexts and the ways in which they have used their cultural heritage to create something entirely new and innovative.
I completely agree, Leo. And I think that's what makes this criterion so fascinating, the way that both countries have taken their unique cultural heritage and used it to create something entirely new and innovative. Let's move on to our next topic.
Absolutely, Mira. And speaking of moving on, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this criterion. But before we go, I just want to say that I'm loving the conversation we're having about Burundi and Chile's cultural scenes. It's always great to learn more about these two countries and their unique cultural heritage. Who knows? Maybe one day we'll even get to explore the Burundian and Chilean coffee and wine scenes together.
Well, I think that's a great idea, Leo. And who knows? Maybe one day we'll even get to feature some of the amazing Burundian and Chilean artists and musicians on our podcast. Thanks for joining me on this criterion. Everyone, tune into the stunning landscapes of Burundi and Chile, and to share with you the unique natural treasures of each country. Burundi, known for its lush mountains and serene lakes, has a breathtaking beauty that's often overlooked.
I completely agree. Yeah, Burundi's natural scenery is indeed breathtaking. Have you heard about the Ira National Park? It's a haven for wildlife enthusiasts, with an incredible array of animals, including the endangered chimpanzee.
Yes, I've heard great things about Ira National Park. But let's not forget about Chile's natural wonders. From the Atacama Desert to the majestic mountains of Patagonia, Chile has an incredible diversity of landscapes.
And don't forget about the scenic Lake Tanganyika, which lies on the border of Chile and Peru. Its crystal clear waters and picturesque villages are a sight to behold.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments. But for me, the natural beauty of Burundi and Chile is a major draw for tourists and adventure seekers.
I think that's a great point, Mira. Both countries offer a unique blend of adventure and relaxation. In Burundi, you can hike to the top of Mount Hay, which offers stunning views of the surrounding landscape.
Well, that sounds like an incredible experience. And in Chile, you can explore the scenic Lake District, which is home to some of the most beautiful lakes and mountains in the world.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Burundi would agree with me that the country's natural beauty is one of its greatest assets. And Chileans would likely say the same about their country's stunning landscapes.
That's a great point, Leo. But I think what sets Burundi apart is its unique blend of African and European cultures. The country's colonial history has left a lasting impact on its architecture and cuisine.
Oh, I see what you mean. Mira, Burundi's cultural heritage is indeed fascinating. And Chile's cultural influences are also worth exploring, particularly in the cities of Santiago and Valparaiso.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Have you ever visited either Burundi or Chile? If so, what were your impressions of the natural beauty and landscapes?
I think that's a great question, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the experiences of fellow travelers.
Let's take a closer look at the natural wonders of Burundi. The country is home to several stunning national parks, including the RUVU National Park, which is known for its diverse wildlife and beautiful scenery.
And in Chile, you can explore the scenic Torres del Paine National Park, which is a UNESCO biosphere reserve and home to some of the most beautiful mountains and lakes in the world.
I'm certain that our listeners would love to see more photos of these incredible landscapes. If you have any favorite photos or experiences from either Burundi or Chile, please share them with us in the comments.
I think that's a great idea. Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the experiences of fellow travelers.
So, let's talk about the unique natural treasures of each country. Burundi is home to several stunning waterfalls, including the Kanzibiye waterfall, which is a popular spot for hikers and adventure seekers.
And in Chile, you can explore the scenic Lake District, which is home to some of the most beautiful lakes and mountains in the world.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think Burundi or Chile has more to offer in terms of natural beauty and landscapes?
I think that's a great question, Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the experiences of fellow travelers.
Let's take a closer look at the unique natural wonders of each country. Burundi is home to several stunning mountains, including the Mount Hay, which offers stunning views of the surrounding landscape.
And in Chile, you can explore the scenic Atacama Desert, which is one of the driest places on Earth and home to several unique natural wonders, including the Salar de Atacama.
I'm certain that our listeners would love to see more photos of these incredible landscapes. If you have any favorite photos or experiences from either Burundi or Chile, please share them with us in the comments.
I think that's a great idea, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the experiences of fellow travelers.
So, let's talk about the unique cultural influences of each country. Burundi's colonial history has left a lasting impact on its architecture and cuisine.
And in Chile, you can explore the cultural influences of the Mapuche people, who are the indigenous people of Chile and have a rich cultural heritage.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Have you ever visited either Burundi or Chile? If so, what were your impressions of the cultural influences?
I think that's a great question, Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the experiences of fellow travelers.
Let's take a closer look at the cultural heritage of Burundi. The country's colonial history has left a lasting impact on its architecture and cuisine.
And in Chile, you can explore the cultural influences of the Spanish and German settlers, who have left a lasting impact on the country's cuisine and architecture.
I'm certain that our listeners would love to see more photos of these incredible cultural influences. If you have any favorite photos or experiences from either Burundi or Chile, please share them with us in the comments.
I think that's a great idea, Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the experiences of fellow travelers.
Let's talk about Burundi and Chile, two countries that will surely get your adrenaline pumping. I'm to share some of the amazing sports and adventure options in each country. Who's ready to get active?
I'm more than ready. Burundi, in particular, has a fascinating history of sports. They're known for their impressive athletics, particularly in the 400 meters and 800 meters events. I mean, who wouldn't want to be a champion like that?
That's right. Leo. And speaking of champions, have you heard about the Burundian national team's incredible performance in the African Games? They took home a gold medal in the men's 400 meters relay.
Wow, that's impressive. I'm starting to think that Burundi is the new powerhouse in athletics. But let's not forget about Chile, shall we? They have an incredible passion for skiing and snowboarding. I mean, who wouldn't want to hit the slopes in the beautiful Andes?
Exactly. And did you know that Chile is home to some of the most challenging ski resorts in South America? Portillo is one of them, and it's a favorite among expert skiers.
Ah, I've heard of Portillo. It's like the Mecca of skiing in South America. But what about Burundi? What kind of adventure options do they have?
Well, Leo, Burundi is actually a great destination for hiking and trekking. The country has some of the most beautiful and challenging trails in Africa, and the scenery is simply breathtaking.
That sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the hiking trails in Burundi. Can you tell us more about them? Mira?
Of course. Leo, the most popular hiking trail in Burundi is the Kibira National Park Trek. It's a 3-day hike that takes you through stunning rainforests and offers breathtaking views of the surrounding landscape.
Wow, that sounds incredible. I'm definitely adding Burundi to my bucket list. And speaking of bucket lists, have you ever thought about going on an adventure in Chile? Mira?
Actually, Leo, I've always wanted to go paragliding in Chile. The views of the Andes from up high must be simply stunning.
That's a great idea. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about paragliding in Chile. Can you tell us more about it? Mira?
Well, Leo, paragliding in Chile is a must-do adventure for any thrill seeker. You can fly over the beautiful Andes, take in the breathtaking views of the surrounding landscape, and even spot some of the local wildlife.
That sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners are getting about all the adventure options in Burundi and Chile. Let's talk about something else, shall we?
What about motorsports? Leo, both Burundi and Chile have some amazing opportunities for surfing, kayaking, and even scuba diving.
Water sports are a great idea. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the best spots for surfing in Burundi and Chile.
Well, Leo, Burundi has some of the best surfing spots in Africa. The most popular spot is the Lake Tanganyika, which offers some of the best surfing waves in the country.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I'm definitely adding Lake Tanganyika to my bucket list. And speaking of bucket lists, have you ever thought about going on a road trip in Chile? Mira?
Actually, Leo, I've always wanted to go on a road trip along the Pan-American Highway in Chile. The scenery is simply breathtaking, and you can stop at some of the most beautiful national parks in the country.
That's a great idea. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the best spots to stop on the Pan-American Highway in Chile.
Well, Leo, some of the best spots to stop on the Pan-American Highway in Chile are the national parks of Torres del Paine and del Chaltén. Those parks offer some of the most stunning scenery in the country, and you can even hike to the base of some of the highest mountains in South America.
Wow, that sounds incredible. I'm sure our listeners are getting about all the adventure options in Burundi and Chile. Let's wrap up this topic, shall we?
Absolutely. Leo, I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot about the sports and adventure options in Burundi and Chile. And who knows, maybe one day, they'll be able to try some of these amazing activities for themselves.
That's right. Mira, and don't forget to check out our next topic, where we'll be discussing the best food options in both countries. It's going to be a delicious topic. Trust me.
I'm of Burundi's nightlife scene, and I imagine it's a bit more low-key. Don't you think, Leo? People tend to gather in smaller groups, enjoying traditional music and dancing.
Actually, Mira, Burundi's got a vibrant nightlife, especially in Bujumbura, the capital city. The bars and clubs might not be as flashy as those in other countries, but the energy is infectious.
I love that, and I'm sure the music is a big part of it. Burundian music has such a unique rhythm and style. I can almost imagine the crowds swaying to the beat.
Exactly. And it's not just the music, the people, the culture. The whole atmosphere is so welcoming. You often see locals and visitors dancing together, united by the love of music.
That's wonderful. And I'm curious, have you ever been to a traditional Burundian dance performance? I've heard they're truly mesmerizing.
Yes. I've had the pleasure of attending a few, and they're indeed unforgettable. The energy is electric, and the dancers' movements are so fluid and captivating.
I can imagine. And I'm sure the food and drinks are an integral part of the nightlife experience in Burundi. What are some popular local beverages, Leo?
Well, Mira, you'll find plenty of local beers and juices. But one popular drink is called mwenge. It's a type of beer made from fermented cassava or plantains.
The moine? That sounds fascinating. And I'm sure it's an acquired taste. But I'd love to try it. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried any local drinks in Burundi that didn't quite agree with you?
Yes. I have to admit. Mira, I once tried a local drink that didn't quite sit well with me. Let's just say it was an interesting experience.
Oh, Leo, you're always making me laugh. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about your adventures in Burundi.
Well, maybe another time. Mira, but I'm sure our listeners would agree that Burundi's nightlife scene is definitely worth exploring.
Absolutely. And now, let's move on to Chile, a country known for its vibrant nightlife and stunning cities. What are some of your favorite nightlife spots in Santiago? Leo?
Santiago is a city that never sleeps. Mira, from the trendy bars in Bella Vista to the rooftop clubs in Providencia, there's something for every taste and style.
I love that. And I'm sure the Chilean nightlife scene is also influenced by the country's rich cultural heritage. Can you tell me more about the traditional music and dance in Chile? Leo?
Of course. Mira, Chilean folk music, known as cuca, is a staple of the country's nightlife scene. You'll often see couples dancing the cuca in bars and clubs, especially on weekends.
That's wonderful. And I'm sure the food and drinks in Chile are also an essential part of the nightlife experience. What are some popular local beverages? Leo?
Well, Mira, you'll find plenty of Chilean wines and beers. But one popular drink is called chicha. It's a type of fermented apple cider that's perfect for sipping on a warm evening.
Chicha? That sounds delicious. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the nightlife scene in Chile. Do you have any recommendations for our listeners? Leo?
Absolutely. Mira, if you're visiting Chile, I highly recommend checking out the nightlife in the coastal city of Valparaiso. The views of the city are breathtaking, and the energy is electric.
That sounds amazing. Leo? And I'm sure our listeners would agree that both Burundi and Chile have unique and exciting nightlife scenes. If you have any favorite nightlife spots or experiences in either country, please share them with us in the comments.
And don't forget to try the local drinks. Mira, they might just become your new favorite.
I'm so to dive into the world of family-friendly environments and children's activities in Burundi and Chile. Let's start with Burundi, a country often overlooked but full of hidden gems.
That's right. Mira, Burundi's got a lot to offer families. From the beautiful Lake Tanganyika to the majestic Ibira National Park, there's no shortage of outdoor adventures waiting to be had.
And what about the local culture? I'm sure our listeners living in Burundi would agree with me that the traditional music and dance are a big hit with kids.
Absolutely. The Burundian people are known for their warm hospitality, and their children are often encouraged to participate in traditional dances and music. It's a great way to preserve cultural heritage and create lifelong memories.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried to teach a traditional dance to a group of kids? I bet it's a real challenge.
Oh, you have no idea. I once tried to teach a group of kids the traditional Burundian dance, but let's just say it was more of a mishmash of different moves.
I can just imagine. But seriously, Leo, what about the educational system in Burundi? How does it support children's learning and development?
That's a great question. Mira, Burundi's educational system is actually quite robust, with a strong focus on primary education. However, there are still challenges in terms of access to quality education, especially in rural areas.
I see. And what about Chile? What's the family-friendly scene like there?
Well, Mira, Chile is a great example of a country that's really invested in family-friendly activities. From the beautiful beaches of Vina del Mar to the scenic hiking trails of Patagonia, there's no shortage of outdoor adventures waiting to be had.
That sounds amazing. Leo, and what about the local culture? I'm sure our listeners living in Chile would agree with me that the traditional music and dance are a big hit with kids.
Oh, you're really getting into the rhythm of this conversation, aren't you? But seriously, Mira, Chile has a rich cultural heritage, and its children are often encouraged to participate in traditional dances and music.
Hey, someone's got to keep the conversation lively. But seriously, Leo, what about the educational system in Chile? How does it support children's learning and development?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, Chile's educational system is actually quite strong, with a focus on quality education and access to resources for all students. However, there are still challenges in terms of inequality and access to education, especially in rural areas.
I see. And what about the family-friendly activities in both countries? Are there any unique traditions or customs that stand out?
Now that's a great question. Mira, in Burundi, for example, there's a tradition of family gatherings and celebrations, often centered around traditional music and dance. And in Chile, there's a strong focus on outdoor activities, such as hiking and camping, that bring families together.
That's wonderful. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about these traditions and customs.
Well, Mira, I think we've only scratched the surface of this topic, but I'm sure our listeners will have plenty to say in the comments section.
And I'm sure we'll have plenty to respond to. I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the most important factor in creating a family-friendly environment?
That's a great question. Mira, I think it's a combination of factors, including access to quality education, outdoor activities, and cultural heritage. But also, I think it's about creating a sense of community and connection among families.
I see. And what about in Burundi? What are some unique family-friendly activities that families can enjoy together?
Well, Mira, Burundi has a lot to offer families. From the beautiful beaches of Lake Tanganyika to the scenic hiking trails of Kaiira National Park, there's no shortage of outdoor adventures waiting to be had.
That sounds amazing. Leo, and what about the local culture? I'm sure our listeners living in Burundi would agree with me that the traditional music and dance are a big hit with kids.
Oh, you're really getting into the rhythm of this conversation, aren't you? But seriously, Mira, Burundi has a rich cultural heritage, and its children are often encouraged to participate in traditional dances and music.
Hey, someone's got to keep the conversation lively. But seriously, Leo, what about the educational system in Burundi? How does it support children's learning and development?
That's a great question. Mira, Burundi's educational system is actually quite robust, with a strong focus on primary education. However, there are still challenges in terms of access to quality education, especially in rural areas.
I see. And what about Chile? What's the family-friendly scene like there?
Well, it's kind of like a thing. Mira, Chile is a great example of a country that's really invested in family-friendly activities. From the beautiful beaches of Viña del Mar to the scenic hiking trails of Patagonia, there's no shortage of outdoor adventures waiting to be had.
That sounds amazing. Leo, and what about the local culture? I'm sure our listeners living in Chile would agree with me that the traditional music and dance are a big hit with kids.
Oh, you're really getting into the rhythm of this conversation, aren't you? But seriously, Mira, Chile has a rich cultural heritage, and its children are often encouraged to participate in traditional dances and music.
Hey, someone's got to keep the conversation lively. But seriously, Leo, what about the educational system in Chile? How does it support children's learning and development?
That's a great question. Mira, Chile's educational system is actually quite strong, with a focus on quality education and access to resources for all students. However, there are still challenges in terms of inequality and access to education, especially in rural areas.
I see. And what about the family-friendly activities in both countries? Are there any unique traditions or customs that stand out?
Now that's a great question. Mira, in Burundi, for example, there's a tradition of family gatherings and celebrations, often centered around traditional music and dance. And in Chile, There's a strong focus on outdoor activities, such as hiking and camping, that bring families together.
That's wonderful. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever attended a pride event in a foreign country?
Actually, I have, and it was a blast. But let's talk about Burundi and Chile, our two countries for this criterion. What's your take on LGBT-friendly atmosphere in Burundi?
Well, I did some research, and it seems that Burundi is still quite conservative when it comes to LGBT rights. But, you know, I've always said that even in the most unlikely places, you can find pockets of acceptance and love.
That's true, Mira. And in Burundi's case, there are some organizations and communities working tirelessly to promote LGBT rights and inclusivity. But, as you said, it's still a challenging environment.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Burundi would agree with me that there's a long way to go in terms of acceptance and protection. But, hey, let's not be too gloomy. What about Chile? Leo, how does it compare?
Chile is a different story altogether. It's one of the most progressive countries in South America when it comes to LGBT rights. In fact, Chile was one of the first countries in South America to legalize same-sex marriage.
Wow, that's amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about Chile's LGBT community. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think Chile's progressiveness is an inspiration for other countries in the region?
Absolutely. Mira, Chile's progressiveness is definitely an inspiration for other countries, and it shows that even in conservative regions, change is possible. And speaking of change, I have to say that Burundi's LGBT community is also making strides, despite the challenges they face.
That's so true. Leo, and I think it's wonderful to see that even in countries with conservative laws, there are still people fighting for their rights and acceptance. It's all about community and solidarity, right?
Exactly. Mira, and it's not just about community. It's also about individual courage and resilience. I mean, can you imagine being a gay man in Burundi, where same-sex relationships are still punishable by law?
Oh, Leo, that's a tough one. But, as I said, even in the most challenging environments, there are still people who are willing to take risks and fight for their rights. And who knows, maybe one day Burundi will be a leader in LGBT rights in Africa.
You never know, Mira. And in the meantime, we can continue to support and amplify the voices of LGBT individuals in Burundi and around the world. If you think this is wrong, please, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely. Leo, and speaking of comments, I'm sure our listeners have some amazing stories and experiences to share. So, let's hear from them. Do you have any funny anecdotes about LGBT-friendly atmosphere in Burundi or Chile? Leo?
Actually, I do have one. So, I was at a pride event in Chile, and I saw a group of people dressed in elaborate costumes, dancing to a fabulous drag show. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. But then I realized that one of the performers was a trans woman from Burundi, who had traveled all the way to Chile to perform.
Wow, that's incredible. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about that story. Maybe we can even get in touch with that performer and share their story with us.
That's a great idea, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the LGBT community in Burundi and Chile. Maybe we can even plan a future episode on this topic.
Absolutely. Leo, and who knows, maybe one day we'll have a special episode on LGBT-friendly atmosphere in Burundi and Chile, featuring some of the amazing individuals and organizations working tirelessly for change.
You never know, Mira. But for now, let's just say that we're grateful to be able to share these stories and experiences with our listeners. And if you're living in Burundi or Chile, or if you're just interested in LGBT rights and inclusivity, please keep listening and keep sharing your thoughts and experiences with us.
When it comes to hospitality and attitudes towards foreigners, Burundi and Chile have some fascinating stories to share. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever been to either of these countries?
Actually, I visited Burundi a few years ago, and I was struck by the warm welcomes I received from locals. They'd invite me to share meals with them, and I'd get to experience their traditional cuisine. It was amazing.
Well, that sounds incredible. I've heard that Burundians are known for their generosity and openness to visitors. I'm sure our listeners living in Burundi would agree with me that the locals are incredibly friendly.
That's true. But what about Chile? I've been to Chile a few times, and I've noticed that the Chileans are a bit more reserved when it comes to interacting with foreigners. They might not be as quick to invite you to share meals with them, but they're still very welcoming.
That's an interesting point. I've heard that Chileans value their personal space and might take a bit more time to warm up to visitors. But I'm sure our listeners living in Chile would agree that the locals are still very friendly and welcoming in their own way.
Absolutely. And I think it's great that both countries have their unique approaches to hospitality. In Burundi, it's all about sharing meals and breaking bread together. While in Chile, it's more about respecting personal space and building relationships slowly.
I love that. And speaking of building relationships, I've heard that both countries have a strong sense of community and family ties. In Burundi, it's not uncommon for families to live together in close-knit villages, while in Chile, the concept of driest is an important part of family and community life.
Ah, yes. Driest is a beautiful tradition in Chile where godparents are also considered to be part of the family. It's a way of building strong relationships and creating a sense of community.
That's so cool. And I'm sure our listeners living in both countries would agree that the sense of community and family ties is a big part of what makes these countries so special.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of cultural identity and tradition. In Burundi, the traditional music and dance are an important part of the culture. While in Chile, the Mapuche people have a rich cultural heritage that is still celebrated today.
Wow, I didn't know this about the Mapuche people. It's amazing how much cultural diversity there is in both countries.
And I think it's great that both countries are working to preserve their cultural heritage and pass it down to future generations. It's a way of keeping their traditions alive and sharing them with the world.
I completely agree. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the cultural traditions of both countries. If you're living in Burundi or Chile, we'd love to hear about your experiences and traditions in the comments section.
Absolutely. And I'm sure our listeners would also love to hear more about the unique challenges and opportunities that come with living in these countries. So let's keep the conversation going and hear from our listeners.
And before we go, I just want to say that I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share these stories with you all. It's been an absolute pleasure to explore the hospitality and attitudes towards foreigners in Burundi and Chile.
Agreed. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's been a fascinating conversation. Thanks for joining us.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and hit that like button if you enjoyed this episode. We'll be back with more exciting conversations soon.
And if you have any suggestions for future episodes or topics, please let us know in the comments section. We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you all on the flip side.
Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.
So let's dive into the world of internet infrastructure in Burundi and Chile. Both countries have unique digital landscapes, but how do they compare? I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried to navigate the internet in Burundi?
Yes, I have. And let me tell you, it was an adventure. The internet is relatively underdeveloped in Burundi, but the government is working to improve connectivity. Did you know that Burundi has a fiber optic network that spans the entire country?
Wow, that's impressive. But I'm sure our listeners would agree that fast internet is not just about the infrastructure, but also about affordability. In Burundi, the cost of internet is still relatively high compared to other countries in the region. Have you ever tried to get a decent internet connection in a small town in Burundi? Leo?
Well, I have. And let me tell you, it was an experience. But seriously, Mira, affordability is a huge issue in Burundi. the cost of internet is still a barrier for many people, especially in rural areas.
I completely agree. And that's why Chile is doing so well in terms of internet infrastructure. Chile has one of the most developed internet networks in the world, with fast and affordable internet available to almost everyone. I'm sure our listeners living in Chile would agree with me that having a reliable internet connection is a must in today's digital age.
Yeah, Chile is definitely a leader in this area. But what about digital nomads? Mira, how do they fare in Burundi and Chile? I'm sure our listeners who are digital nomads would love to know more about the digital nomad scene in these countries.
Great question. Leo. So, in Burundi, digital nomads are still a relatively new phenomenon, but there are some great initiatives and communities emerging. For example, there's a digital nomad community in Bujumbura that offers co-working space, networking events, and other resources for remote workers.
That sounds amazing. And in Chile, digital nomads have a whole different experience. Chile has a thriving digital nomad community, with many co-working spaces, networking events, and other resources available. Did you know that Santiago, the capital city of Chile, has a whole neighborhood dedicated to digital nomads?
Wow, that's incredible. And I'm sure our listeners who are digital nomads would love to know more about the cost of living in these countries. How does the cost of living in Burundi compare to Chile? Leo?
Well, let's just say that Burundi is still a very affordable country, but Chile is not. But, seriously, Mira, the cost of living in Burundi is still relatively low, especially compared to other countries in the region. However, Chile is a more developed country, and the cost of living is higher.
I see. And what about innovation? Leo? How does Burundi compare to Chile in terms of innovation and tech entrepreneurship?
Well, Chile is definitely a leader in innovation and tech entrepreneurship. Chile has a thriving startup scene, with many incubators, accelerators, and other resources available for entrepreneurs. Burundi, on the other hand, is still developing its innovation ecosystem, but there are some great initiatives emerging, such as the Burundi Innovation Hub.
That's great to hear. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the opportunities for innovation and entrepreneurship in these countries. Have you ever tried to start a business in Burundi? Leo?
Well, I have tried, and let me tell you, it was an experience. But seriously, Nira, starting a business in Burundi can be challenging, but there are also many opportunities available, especially in the tech sector.
I see. And finally, let's talk about the future of internet infrastructure in these countries. What do you think the future holds for Burundi and Chile in terms of internet connectivity and digital innovation? Leo?
Well, I think the future is bright for both countries. Burundi is working to improve its internet infrastructure, and Chile is already a leader in this area. I'm sure that with the right investments and initiatives, both countries will continue to develop their digital landscapes and provide more opportunities for their citizens and digital nomads alike.
I completely agree. Leo? And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the opportunities and challenges facing these countries. If you have any comments or questions, please let us know in the comments below. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more exciting content.
I'm tuned to the shopping scene in Burundi and Chile. When I think of Burundi, I imagine vibrant markets filled with colorful textiles and handicrafts. Have you ever been to a market in Burundi? Leo?
Actually, Mira, I haven't been to Burundi, but I've heard great things about its markets. In fact, I've been told that the best way to experience Burundi's culture is to visit the local markets and try some of the traditional foods. What's your favorite thing to buy in a Burundian market?
Well, I love buying handmade crafts and textiles. There's something so special about supporting local artisans and taking home a unique piece of art. And, of course, the prices are very reasonable. I'm certain that our listeners living in Burundi would agree with me that the markets are a treasure trove of affordable and beautiful items.
That's true. I've heard that Burundi has a rich tradition of craftsmanship, and the markets are a great place to see it in action. But I have to ask, Mira, how do you handle the bargaining in the markets? I've heard that it can be a bit spirited.
Oh, yes. Bargaining is definitely a part of the market experience in Burundi. But I found that it's all part of the fun. I like to think of it as a game, where you try to negotiate the best price for the item you want. And, of course, it's a great way to practice your haggling skills.
I can imagine. Well, in Chile, the shopping scene is a bit different. You have a mix of traditional markets, known as ferias, and modern shopping malls. What's your take on the shopping experience in Chile, Mira?
I love the ferias in Chile. They're so much fun. And you can find everything from fresh produce to handicrafts. And, of course, the prices are very reasonable. I've also been to some of the modern shopping malls in Santiago, and they're amazing. You can find anything you need there.
That's true. Chile has a great shopping culture, with a mix of traditional and modern options. But I have to ask, Mira, how do you compare the prices in Burundi and Chile? I've heard that Chile is a bit more expensive than Burundi.
That's true. Chile is a bit more expensive than Burundi, but I think it's worth it. The quality of goods in Chile is very high, and you can find some amazing deals if you know where to look. But in Burundi, the prices are definitely more affordable.
I see what you mean. Well, I think it's also worth noting that Burundi has a more limited range of shopping options, whereas Chile has a more developed shopping culture. But I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about their shopping experiences in both countries.
Absolutely. And if you're a shopper, you'll love the markets in Burundi. They're a treasure trove of affordable and beautiful items. And, of course, the people are so friendly and welcoming. I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that the markets are a must-visit destination in Burundi.
I'm sure they would. Well, I think that's all the time we have for today's topic. Thanks for sharing your insights on the shopping scene in Burundi and Chile. Mira.
Thank you. Leo, it was my pleasure to share my experiences with our listeners. And to our listeners, I hope you enjoyed this episode and will join us next time for more comparisons between Burundi and Chile.
And don't forget to check out our next episode, where we'll be comparing the nightlife scenes in Burundi and Chile. It's going to be a wild ride.
I'm looking forward to it. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring. Dive into the cultural events, festivals, and concert opportunities in Burundi and Chile. From UNESCO-recognized sites to local festivities and global influences. We're going to explore each country's unique cultural calendar and how it unites people in celebration. These insights could have been possible without Jet Off. A. By referring to cultural trends.
That's right. Mira, I'm to share with our listeners the rich cultural heritage of both countries. Let's start with Burundi. Their music scene is incredible, with a mix of traditional and modern styles. You can find everything from folk music to hip-hop.
That's amazing. And I'm sure our listeners living in Burundi would agree with me. The cultural events in Burundi are truly unique, with festivals like the Festival of the Sacred Heart, which celebrates the country's Catholic heritage.
Exactly. And Chile, on the other hand, has a more diverse cultural calendar. From the Fiestas de la Vendimia in the wine region of Mapo to the Fiestas de la Tirana in Santiago, there's always something happening.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think Chile's cultural events are more vibrant than Burundi's? Let's get into the specifics of each country's festivals and concert opportunities.
Well, Burundi has the Festival of the Sacred Heart, as Mira mentioned, and also the Festival of the Arts, which showcases local music, dance, and theater. And let's not forget the traditional drumming and dancing.
That's right. And Chile has the Fiestas de la Tirana, which is a huge celebration of music, dance, And food. You can find traditional Chilean folk music, as well as modern rock and pop.
But Burundi's festivals are more intimate and community-based. The music and dancing are often accompanied by traditional instruments like the umaduri and the inanga.
I love that. And Chile's festivals are more commercialized, with a focus on tourism and entertainment. But that's not to say they're not fun. Who wouldn't want to dance the night away in the streets of Santiago?
Ah, exactly. And let's not forget the music scene in both countries. Burundi has a rich tradition of folk music, while Chile has a more diverse range of styles, from folk to rock to pop.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Chile would agree with me. The music scene in Chile is incredibly vibrant, with a wide range of genres to choose from.
And what about the role of technology in cultural events? Burundi has been using social media to promote their festivals and concerts, while Chile has been experimenting with virtual reality experiences.
That's a great point. Technology can definitely enhance the cultural experience. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the logistics of attending these events.
Well, for more information on attending festivals and concerts in both Burundi and Chile, I recommend checking out Jitoth, AI's cultural events calendar.
That's right. And don't forget to follow us on social media for the latest updates on cultural events and festivals in both countries.
And if you have any questions or comments, please let us know in the comments section below. We'd love to hear from you.
So, there you have it, folks. A brief overview of the cultural events, festivals, and concert opportunities in Burundi and Chile. We hope you've enjoyed this episode and will join us next time for more cultural explorations.
And don't forget to tune into our next episode, where we'll be exploring the food scene in both countries. It's going to be a wild ride.
So to dive into this topic, opportunities and ease of learning the local language. With our first country, Burundi, and second country, Chile. Burundi's language. Kirundi is a Bantu language, closely related to Swahili, and it's estimated that over 90% of the population speaks Kirundi as their first language. Leo, what are your thoughts on language learning in Burundi?
Mira, I've had my fair share of language learning adventures. And I must say, Burundi's language scene is quite unique. From what I've gathered, there are several language schools and centers in Bujumbura, the capital city, that offer courses in Kirundi. But I've also heard that many locals are willing to teach foreigners the language in exchange for help with tasks or language exchange. What do you think about that, Mira?
That's so true. Leo, I've heard that many Burundians are eager to practice their English skills. And in return, they'd love to teach you Kirundi. It's a great way to immerse yourself in the culture and learn the language at the same time. And, if I'm not mistaken, Chile has a similar approach to language learning, with many locals willing to teach foreigners Spanish in exchange for language exchange or help with tasks.
Exactly. Mira, Chileans are known for their warm hospitality, and many of them are eager to practice their English skills with foreigners. But I've also heard that Chilean Spanish is quite different from the Spanish spoken in other countries, with its own unique dialect and vocabulary. Have you encountered any challenges when trying to learn Chilean Spanish? Mira.
Actually, Leo, I found that Chilean Spanish is quite similar to the Spanish spoken in Argentina and Uruguay, with its own unique slang and expressions. But I do agree that it can be challenging to learn, especially for those who are not familiar with the Latin American dialects. And speaking of dialects, Burundi has several dialects of Kirundi, including Kirundi, Rundi, and Bantu. Which dialect do you think is the most widely spoken? Leo?
Mira, that's a great question. From what I've gathered, Kirundi is the most widely spoken dialect, but Rundi is also widely spoken, particularly in the northern regions of Burundi. And I've also heard that Bantu is a more formal dialect, often used in official contexts. But I'm curious, Mira, have you found any resources online that can help learners of Kirundi such as language courses or language learning apps?
Actually, Leo, I've found several resources online that can help learners of Kirundi, including language courses, language learning apps, and even YouTube channels dedicated to teaching Kirundi. And I'm sure that our listeners living in Burundi would agree with me that the best way to learn Kirundi is to immerse yourself in the language and culture. If you're living in Burundi and would like to share your experiences with language learning, please let us know in the comments.
That's a great idea. Mira, and I'm sure that our listeners living in Chile would also agree with me that the best way to learn Spanish is to practice with native speakers. But I've also heard that Chile has a unique approach to language learning, with many schools and institutions offering language courses and programs specifically designed for foreigners. Can you tell us more about that, Mira?
Actually, Leah, I found that Chile has a vibrant language learning scene, with many schools and institutions offering language courses and programs specifically designed for foreigners. From what I've gathered, the Universidad de Chile and the Universidad Católica de Chile are two of the most reputable institutions for language learning in Chile. And I've also heard that many language schools in Chile offer courses in Spanish, as well as other languages such as English, French, and German.
That's fascinating. Mira, and I'm sure that our listeners would love to know more about the language learning scene in Chile. If you're living in Chile and would like to share your experiences with language learning, please let us know in the comments. And, Mira, I'm curious, have you found any language learning apps or resources that can help learners of Spanish, such as Duolingo or Babbel?
Actually, Leo, I found that Duolingo and Babbel are two of the most popular language learning apps for Spanish. But I've also heard that there are several other resources available, such as language learning podcasts and YouTube channels. And speaking of language learning podcasts, I found a great podcast called Coffee Break Spanish that offers lessons and conversations in Spanish.
Mira, that's a great resource. And I'm sure that our listeners would love to know more about language learning podcasts. If you're living in Chile or Burundi and would like to share your favorite language learning resources, please let us know in the comments. And, Mira, I'm curious, have you found any cultural immersion programs or language exchange programs in Burundi or Chile that can help learners of the local language?
Actually, Leo, I found several cultural immersion programs and language exchange programs in Burundi and Chile that can help learners of the local language. From what I've gathered, the Go Abroad website offers several programs in Burundi and Chile that allow learners to immerse themselves in the language and culture. And I've also heard that many language schools in Burundi and Chile offer language exchange programs that pair learners with native speakers.
That's a great resource. Mira, and I'm sure that our listeners would love to know more about cultural immersion programs and language exchange programs. If you're living in Burundi or Chile and would like to share your experiences with language learning, please let us know in the comments. And, Mira, I'm curious, what do you think is the most challenging part of learning a new language, such as Kirundi or Spanish?
Leo, that's a great question. I think that the most challenging part of learning a new language is the grammar and vocabulary. But I also think that cultural immersion and practice with native speakers are essential for mastering the language. And speaking of cultural immersion, I found that Burundi has a rich cultural heritage, with many festivals and traditions that celebrate the country's history and identity.
Mira, that's fascinating. And I'm sure that our listeners would love to know more about Burundi's cultural heritage. If you're living in Burundi and would like to share experiences with cultural immersion, please let us know in the comments. And, Mira, I'm curious, what do you think is the most rewarding part of learning a new language, such as Kirundi or Spanish?
Leo, that's a great question. I think that the most rewarding part of learning a new language is being able to communicate with native speakers and immerse yourself in the culture. And, speaking of rewards, I'm sure our listeners have heard of Burundi, a small country in East Africa, but have you guys thought about its safety record for women travelers? It's a complex issue, but I want to dive into it.
Yes. Burundi, while it's true that safety can be a concern, I've spoken to several female travelers who've had wonderful experiences there. But let's get into the numbers. According to the UN, Burundi has one of the highest rates of violence against women in the world.
That's a scary statistic, Leo, but I'm sure our listeners are. What about Chile? Chile has a reputation for being a very safe country, especially for women. But, as we all know, safety is a complex issue and can vary depending on the location and situation.
Exactly. And it's not just about the numbers. It's also about cultural attitudes. In Burundi, for example, women are often expected to dress modestly and avoid certain areas at night. While this can be a challenge for some travelers, it's also a sign of respect for the local culture.
Respectful, but also restrictive, right? I'm sure many of our listeners would agree with me that women should be able to choose how they dress and behave without fear of judgment or harassment.
Absolutely. And Chile is actually a great example of a country that's made significant strides in terms of women's rights and safety. The country has implemented various laws and programs to protect women from violence and harassment.
That's amazing. Leo, I'm curious to know more about the specific initiatives Chile has put in place. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. For example, Chile has a law that requires all public transportation to have women-only carriages during peak hours. It's a small but significant measure that can make a big difference for women who feel uncomfortable or threatened on public transportation.
Well, that's a great idea. I'm sure many of our listeners would appreciate that kind of initiative. And speaking of initiatives, what about community-led programs in Burundi that promote women's safety and empowerment?
Yes. There are many wonderful organizations and initiatives in Burundi that are working to promote women's rights and safety. For example, there are programs that provide training and support for women to become community leaders and advocates for women's rights.
That's so inspiring. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about how they can support these initiatives. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Absolutely. Many of these organizations rely on donations and volunteer support. So, if you're interested in supporting women's rights and safety in Burundi, I encourage you to look into these organizations and see how you can get involved.
That's a great idea. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the resources and information you've provided. Now, let's talk a bit more about Chile. What about the cultural attitudes towards women in Chile? Are they generally supportive of women's rights and safety?
Yes. Chile has a strong feminist movement and a culture that values women's empowerment. However, there are still challenges and biases that exist, particularly in rural areas or among certain communities.
That's a great point. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would agree that women's rights and safety are not just about laws and programs, but also about cultural attitudes and societal norms.
Exactly. And I think that's where community-led initiatives and education can play a big role in promoting women's rights and safety.
Absolutely. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about these initiatives and how they can get involved. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. For example, there are programs that provide education and training for men and boys to promote positive attitudes towards women and girls. It's a great way to address the root causes of violence and harassment.
That's a wonderful idea. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would appreciate the resources and information you've provided. Now, let's summarize what we've discussed so far. What are some key takeaways from our conversation about Burundi and Chile?
Well, one key takeaway is that safety is a complex issue that requires a multifaceted approach. It's not just about laws and programs, but also about cultural attitudes and societal norms.
Absolutely. And another key takeaway is that community-led initiatives and education can play a big role in promoting women's rights and safety.
Exactly. And I think it's also worth noting that both Burundi and Chile have made significant strides in terms of women's rights and safety. But there is still much work to be done.
That's a great point. Leo, And I'm sure our listeners would agree that women's rights and safety are a global issue that requires a collective effort to address.
Absolutely. And I think that's where our listeners come in. By sharing their own experiences and perspectives, they can help to create a more informed and supportive community for women travelers.
That's a great idea, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the opportunity to share their thoughts and experiences. So, let's open it up to our listeners. What do you think about the safety and comfort for women travelers in Burundi and Chile? Do you have any personal experiences or perspectives to share? I'm intrigued by the concept of the Gitega court in Burundi, which deals with community-based justice. It's like a neighborhood watch, but with judges in a more formal process.
Ah, yes. The Gitega courts are a unique aspect of Burundian law. They're a way to address traditional crimes and bring community members together to resolve disputes. It's almost like a mini trial, but with a more, let's say, village-like atmosphere.
Village-like? I like that. And I'm curious. Leo, have you ever been to a Gitega court? I mean, would you want to be a part of one?
Well, I think I'd rather stick to my stand-up comedy routine. Thank you very much. But, seriously, Mira, the Gitega courts are an important part of Burundian culture. They promote community participation and reconciliation.
That's fascinating. And speaking of culture, let's talk about Chile. Have you heard about the Garantía de los Derechos de la Niñez in Chile, which is the specialized court for children's rights?
Yes. The Chilean justice system has made significant efforts to protect children's rights. The Guarantee is a great example of that. But I'm curious. Mira, how do you think the Gitega courts in Burundi compare to the Guarantee in Chile?
That's a great question. Leo, I think both systems share the goal of promoting justice and community involvement. But the Gitega courts in Burundi are more focused on traditional crimes and community-based justice. The Guarantee in Chile, on the other hand, is more focused on protecting children's rights and providing specialized care.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's interesting to note that both countries have made efforts to modernize their justice systems and address human rights concerns. But I'm curious, what do you think about the role of the media in shaping public opinion about justice in Burundi and Chile?
Great question. Leo? I think the media plays a crucial role in shaping public opinion. But it's also important to note that the media can sometimes perpetuate stereotypes and biases. In Burundi, for example, the media has been criticized for its biased reporting on the Gitega courts.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's interesting to note that both countries have made efforts to improve media freedom and promote independent journalism. But I'm curious, what do you think about the impact of social media on justice in Burundi and Chile?
That's a great question. Leo, I think social media has both positive and negative impacts on justice in both countries. On the one hand, social media can provide a platform for marginalized voices to be heard and can facilitate access to justice. On the other hand, social media can also perpetuate hate speech and misinformation.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's interesting to note that both countries have made efforts to regulate social media and promote digital literacy. But I'm curious, what do you think about the role of technology in shaping justice in Burundi and Chile?
Great question. Leo, I think technology has the potential to greatly improve access to justice in both countries. For example, online platforms can provide access to legal information and facilitate online dispute resolution.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's interesting to note that both countries have made efforts to promote digital justice and provide online access to legal services. But I'm curious, what do you think about the impact of technology on the Gitega courts in Burundi?
That's a great question. I think technology can actually help improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the Gitega courts. For example, online platforms can facilitate communication between community members and judges.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's interesting to note that both countries have made efforts to promote technology and innovation in the justice sector. But I'm curious, what do you think about the impact of technology on the Guarantee in Chile?
Great question. Leo, I think technology can actually help improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the guarantee. For example, online platforms can facilitate communication between judges and children's rights advocates.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's interesting to note that both countries have made efforts to promote technology and innovation in the justice sector. But I'm curious, what do you think about the role of civil society in promoting justice in Burundi and Chile?
Great question. Leo, I think civil society plays a crucial role in promoting justice in both countries. For example, civil society organizations can provide support and advocacy for marginalized communities.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's interesting to note that both countries have made efforts to promote civil society engagement and participation in the justice sector. But I'm curious, what do you think about the impact of civil society on the Gaka courts in Burundi?
That's a great question. Leo, I think civil society can actually help improve the effectiveness of the Gaka courts. For example, civil society organizations can provide support and advocacy for community members.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's interesting to note that both countries have made efforts to promote civil society engagement and participation in the justice sector. But I'm curious, what do you think about the impact of civil society on the guarantee in Chile?
Great question. Leo, I think civil society can actually help improve the effectiveness of the guarantee. For example, civil society organizations can provide support and advocacy for children's rights.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's interesting to note that both countries have made efforts to promote civil society engagement and participation in the justice sector. But I'm curious, what do you think about the role of the international community in promoting justice in Burundi and Chile?
Great question. Leo, I think the international community plays a crucial role in promoting justice in both countries. For example, international organizations can provide technical assistance and support for justice sector reform.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's interesting to note that both countries have made efforts to engage with the international community and promote cooperation on justice sector reform. But I'm curious, what do you think about the impact of international cooperation on the Gaka courts in Burundi?
That's a great question. Leo, I think international cooperation can actually help improve the effectiveness of the Gaka. For example, international organizations can provide technical assistance and support for community-based justice.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's interesting to note that both countries have made efforts to engage with the international community and promote cooperation on justice sector reform.
I'm to dive into the spa, healthy living, and relaxation opportunities in Burundi and Chile. Both countries have a unique approach to wellness, and I'm curious to see how they compare.
That's right, Mira. Burundi, being a landlocked country, has a more rugged terrain, which can be beneficial for outdoor activities like hiking and trekking. Meanwhile, Chile's long coastline offers a range of water-based relaxation options.
I completely agree. Leo, Burundi's natural beauty is indeed breathtaking. But let's talk about the spa scene in both countries. I've heard that Burundi has a few luxury resorts that offer spa treatments, but they're relatively few and far between.
That's correct, Mira. However, Chile has a more developed spa industry, with numerous high-end resorts and hotels offering a range of treatments. From hot springs to massages, Chileans know how to relax.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's fair to say that Chile has a more developed spa industry than Burundi?
Well, I think it's safe to say that Chile's tourism infrastructure is more developed, which includes its spa industry. But that doesn't mean Burundi can't offer unique relaxation experiences.
That's a great point. Leo, Burundi's natural hot springs are a great example of this. The Cozy Hot Springs, located in the north of the country, are a popular spot for relaxation and rejuvenation.
Yes. The Cozy Hot Springs are a hidden gem, and Chile has its own version of natural hot springs, too. The Pucón Hot Springs, located in the south of the country, are a popular spot for relaxation and adventure.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Burundi would agree with me when I say that the country's natural hot springs are a major draw for tourists.
Absolutely, Mira. And Chile's hot springs are just as popular. But let's not forget about the cultural aspect of relaxation. In Burundi, the concept of umuganda is an important part of the country's culture. It's a day of community service and relaxation. That's fascinating. Mira. In Chile, the concept of paseo is similar. It's a tradition of taking a leisurely stroll, often with family and friends, to relax and enjoy the outdoors.
I love that. Leo. And speaking of outdoor activities, Burundi's Lake Tanganyika is a great spot for water sports and relaxation. The lake's crystal clear waters are perfect for swimming, kayaking, or simply taking in the views.
Yes. Lake Tanganyika is a stunning natural wonder, and Chile's Lake District is just as beautiful. The scenic drives, hiking trails, and water sports make it a popular destination for relaxation and adventure.
I think it's worth noting, Leo, that both countries have a strong emphasis on community and family. In Burundi, the concept of Ubuntu is an important part of the country's culture. It's a philosophy that emphasizes the interdependence of all people.
That's beautiful, Mira. In Chile, the concept of familismo is similar. It's a strong emphasis on family and community, and it's an important part of the country's culture.
I'm curious to know, Leo, what do you think our listeners would say about the cultural aspects of relaxation in Burundi and Chile?
Well, I think it's safe to say that both countries have a strong emphasis on community and family. But I'm also curious to know what our listeners think about the spa industry in both countries.
Oh, that's a great point. Leo, and speaking of the spa industry, I've heard that Chile has a growing trend of wellness tourism. Is that true?
Yes, it is. Mira, Chile's wellness tourism industry is growing rapidly, with many resorts and hotels offering a range of wellness programs and services.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this trend. Do you think it's a good thing for Chile's economy? Or is it a bit too commercialized?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. Mira, on one hand, it's great for the economy, but on the other hand, it can be a bit commercialized. But I think it's a necessary evil in order to attract tourists and promote Chile's wellness industry.
I see what you mean, Leo. And speaking of tourism, I've heard that Burundi is working hard to develop its tourism infrastructure. Is that true?
Yes, it is. Mira, Burundi is working hard to develop its tourism infrastructure, including its spa industry. And I think it's a great move, as it will help to promote the country's natural beauty and unique culture.
I completely agree. Leo, and speaking of unique culture, I've heard that Burundi has a rich tradition of traditional medicine. Is that true?
Yes, it is. Mira, Burundi has a rich tradition of traditional medicine, including herbal remedies and other natural treatments.
I'm fascinated by this. Leo, and speaking of natural remedies, I've heard that Chile has a growing trend of natural health products. Is that true?
Yes, it is. Mira, Chile has a growing trend of natural health products, including herbal remedies and other natural treatments.
I think it's worth noting, Leo, that both countries have a strong emphasis on natural remedies and traditional medicine. And I think that's a great thing, as it shows a respect for the natural world and a commitment to health and wellness.
Absolutely. Mira, and speaking of health and wellness, I've heard that Burundi has a strong tradition of physical fitness. Is that true? Yes, it is. Mira, Burundi has a strong tradition of physical fitness, including sports and physical activities.
I'm impressed by this, Leo. And speaking of sports, I've heard that Chile has a strong tradition of outdoor sports, including hiking and camping.
Ah, yes. Chile is a paradise for outdoor enthusiasts. The Andes Mountains, the lakes, and the forests offer endless opportunities for hiking, camping, and other outdoor activities.
I think it's worth noting, Leo, that both countries have a strong emphasis on outdoor activities and physical fitness, and I think that's a great thing. as it promotes a healthy lifestyle and a connection to nature.
Absolutely. Mira, and speaking of connection to nature, I've heard that Burundi has a strong tradition of environmental conservation. Is that true? Yes, it is. Mira, Burundi has a strong tradition of environmental conservation, including protecting its natural resources and preserving its biodiversity.
I'm impressed by this. Leah, and speaking of conservation, I heard that Chile has a strong tradition of environmental protection. Is that true?
Yes, it is. Mira.
I'm so to dive into the spiritual side of our two countries, Burundi and Chile. When it comes to faith and spirituality, Burundi has a rich cultural heritage, with over 90% of the population identifying as Christian. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever been to a traditional Burundian church service?
Oh, actually, I have. And let me tell you, it was an experience like no other. The energy in the church was electric, with everyone clapping and singing along to the music. It was like a big party, but with a lot of prayer and devotion thrown in. I'm sure our listeners living in Burundi would agree that church is a big part of community life there.
That's so true. And I think it's wonderful how faith brings people together. In Chile, on the other hand, you have a more diverse religious landscape, with a mix of Catholicism, Protestantism, and even some indigenous spiritual practices. I'm curious, Leah, what do you think about the role of Catholicism in Chilean culture?
Well, I think it's still a big part of Chilean identity. But it's also interesting to see how people are exploring other spiritual paths. I mean, have you heard about the Mapuche people, who have their own indigenous spiritual traditions? It's really fascinating to learn about.
Yes, I have. And I think it's great how the Mapuche people are preserving their traditional ways of life. In Burundi, you also have a rich cultural heritage, with many traditional spiritual practices. I'm curious, Leo, what do you think about the role of ancestral spirits in Burundian culture?
That's a great question. From what I've learned, ancestral spirits play a big role in Burundian culture, particularly in the context of traditional healing practices. I'm sure our listeners would be interested to know more about this aspect of Burundian spirituality.
Absolutely. And I think it's fascinating how different cultures have their own unique approaches to spirituality. In Chile, you also have a strong tradition of spiritualism, particularly in the context of the Mapuche people. I'm curious, Leah, what do you think about the role of spiritualism in Chilean culture?
Well, I think it's still a bit of a mystery to me, but I'm always eager to learn more. From what I've learned, spiritualism is all about connecting with the natural world and the spirits that inhabit it. It's really beautiful to see how people in Chile are preserving their traditional spiritual practices.
That's so true. And I think it's wonderful how different cultures are coming together to share their spiritual traditions. If you're listening in Burundi or Chile, I'd love to hear from you in the comments about your own spiritual practices and traditions.
Absolutely. Mira. And I think it's great how we're having this conversation about spirituality in two very different countries. It's really making me think about my own spiritual practices and how I can connect with others on a deeper level.
Oh, I love that. Leo. And I think it's wonderful how we're inspiring each other to explore our own spirituality. In Burundi, you have a saying that goes, Aishai Oka Iwe, which means may God be with you. I think that's such a beautiful way to end our conversation about spirituality.
Oh, I love that phrase. Mira, and I think it's a great way to end our conversation about spirituality in Burundi and Chile. Thanks for sharing your insights and perspectives with me. Mira.
You're welcome, Leo. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into this episode of our podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on social media for more conversations about culture and spirituality.
And don't forget to share your thoughts and comments with us in the comments section below. We love hearing from you and learning more about your experiences and perspectives.
And finally, if you're interested in learning more about Burundian and Chilean spirituality, Be sure to check out some of the resources we've listed in the show notes. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.
And don't forget to support our podcast by donating to our Pat Rayan account. We appreciate your support and can't do it without you.
Time into the social equality, respect for minorities, and diversity in Burundi and Chile. I'm curious. Leo, how do you think these countries measure up in terms of inclusivity?
Well, Mira, Burundi has made significant strides in promoting social equality, especially after the 2005 peace agreement that brought an end to the civil war. However, the country still faces challenges in terms of ethnic and linguistic diversity.
That's really interesting. Leo, I've read that Burundi has a diverse population with over 120 ethnic groups. How does the government address these differences?
That's a great question. Mira, the government has implemented policies to promote national unity and inclusivity, such as the 2018 Constitution, which recognizes the country's diverse ethnic groups and guarantees their rights.
I see. And what about Chile? Leo, how does it compare to Burundi in terms of social equality and respect for minorities?
Well, Chile has a more established tradition of democracy and human rights, but it still has its challenges. For example, the Mapuche indigenous people have been fighting for their rights and land for decades.
That's true. Leo, I heard that the Mapuche people have been protesting against government policies that affect their lands and cultural heritage. What do you think is the biggest challenge facing the Mapuche people in Chile?
I think the biggest challenge is the lack of recognition and respect for their rights as an indigenous people. The government has historically marginalized them. And it's only in recent years that there's been a push for greater recognition and inclusion.
I see. And what about Burundi? Leo, how does the government address the needs of its diverse ethnic groups?
That's a great question. Mira, the government has implemented policies to promote ethnic diversity, such as the creation of a Ministry of National Unity and Social Affairs, which is responsible for promoting national unity and inclusivity.
I'm curious. Leo, how do you think the people of Burundi and Chile view each other's cultures? Do you think there's a sense of mutual respect and understanding?
Well, Mira, I think there's definitely a sense of respect and understanding between the two countries. Burundian and Chileans have a long history of cultural exchange and cooperation, especially in the areas of trade and tourism.
That's really interesting. Leo, I've heard that Burundi and Chile have a strong tradition of cultural exchange, especially in the areas of music and dance.
Yes. Burundian music and dance are incredibly rich and vibrant. And Chilean music and dance are also known for their passion and energy. I think there's definitely a sense of mutual appreciation and respect between the two cultures.
I see. And what about grassroots efforts? Leo, are there any organizations or initiatives in Burundi and Chile that are working to promote social equality and respect for minorities?
Yes. There are many organizations and initiatives in both countries that are working to promote social equality and respect for minorities. For example, in Burundi, there's the Burundian Human Rights Defenders Network, which works to promote human rights and protect vulnerable groups.
I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the most important thing that our listeners can take away from this conversation about social equality and respect for minorities in Burundi and Chile?
I think the most important thing is to recognize that social equality and respect for minorities are ongoing processes that require effort and commitment from all members of society. It's not something that can be achieved overnight, but rather it's a journey that requires patience, understanding, and a willingness to listen and learn.
Well said, Leo. And I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks to our listeners for tuning into this episode of our podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to us on social media.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more conversations about social equality and respect for minorities in different countries around the world.
And if you're living in Burundi or Chile, we'd love to hear from you about your experiences with social equality and respect for minorities in your country.
Thanks again to our listeners for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.
So, when it comes to taxation, Burundi has a relatively simple system. with a flat tax rate of 30% for individuals and 25% for companies. It's worth noting that Burundi is a member of the East African Community, which has a common market and customs union. This might make it easier for long-term immigrants to do business in the country.
That's an interesting point. But Chile, on the other hand, has a more complex tax system, with multiple tax rates and deductions for things like health and education expenses. As a long-term immigrant in Chile, you'd need to navigate this system to take advantage of tax breaks and minimize your tax liability.
Oh, I see. So, Chile's tax system is more geared towards providing benefits to citizens, whereas Burundi's system seems more straightforward. But what about retirement plans? How do these two countries support long-term immigrants in their golden years?
Well, Burundi has a pension fund system that's mandatory for employers, but not for employees. This means that long-term immigrants might not have access to the same retirement benefits as locals. Chile, on the other hand, has a more comprehensive pension system, with both mandatory and voluntary contributions.
That's a great point, Leo. And what about social safety nets? How do these two countries support long-term immigrants in case of illness, injury, or unemployment?
Burundi has a relatively weak social safety net, with limited access to health care and unemployment benefits. Chile, on the other hand, has a more comprehensive social safety net, with universal health care and unemployment insurance for eligible residents.
I'm curious. What do our listeners think about these differences in taxation, retirement, and social rights between Burundi and Chile? Do you think one country is more attractive for long-term immigrants than the other?
I think that's a great question, Mira, and I'd love to hear from our listeners in the comments. But personally, I think Chile's more comprehensive social safety net and pension system make it a more attractive option for long-term immigrants.
That's an interesting perspective. But Burundi's simpler tax system and lower cost of living might make it a more appealing option for some immigrants. It's all about weighing the pros and cons, right?
Exactly, Mira. And it's worth noting that both countries have their own unique cultural and linguistic challenges for long-term immigrants. In Burundi, the official languages are Kirundi and French, while in Chile, the official language is Spanish.
Ah, I see. So, language skills are an important consideration for long-term immigrants in both countries. But what about other factors like healthcare, education, and housing? How do these two countries support long-term immigrants in these areas?
Well, Burundi has a relatively weak healthcare system, with limited access to medical care and equipment. Chile, on the other hand, has a more developed healthcare system, with universal access to healthcare and a range of medical specialties.
That's a great point, Leo. And what about education? How do these two countries support long-term immigrants in terms of access to education and training?
Burundi has a relatively weak education system, with limited access to quality education and training. Chile, on the other hand, has a more developed education system, with a range of public and private universities and vocational training programs.
I'm curious, what do our listeners think about these differences in healthcare, education, and housing between Burundi and Chile? Do you think one country is more attractive for long-term immigrants than the other?
I think that's a great question, Mira, and I'd love to hear from our listeners in the comments. But personally, I think Chile's more developed healthcare system, education system, and social safety net make it a more attractive option for long-term immigrants.
That's an interesting perspective, Leo. But Burundi's simpler tax system and lower cost of living might make it a more appealing option for some immigrants. It's all about weighing the pros and cons, right?
Exactly, Mira. And it's worth noting that both countries have their own unique cultural and linguistic challenges for long-term immigrants. But overall, I think Chile is a more attractive option for long-term immigrants due to its more comprehensive social safety net, pension system, and education system.
I agree, Leo. And I think our listeners will agree with us that Chile is a great option for long-term immigrants. But Burundi's unique culture and lower costs of living might make it a more appealing option for some immigrants. It's all about finding the right balance for your needs and preferences.
Exactly. Mira. And I think that's what makes this podcast so valuable. We're providing a nuanced and balanced view of these two countries and helping our listeners make informed decisions about their future.
Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up our discussion on taxation, retirement, and social rights for long-term immigrants in Burundi and Chile. Thanks for joining us, Leo.
Thanks for having me, Mira. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in.
So, let's dive into the rate of meeting specific interests in Burundi and Chile. Both countries offer unique opportunities for enthusiasts to pursue their passions. I'm curious, Leo, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of niche hobby clubs in Burundi?
Well, I was of the Burundian Association of Chess Players. They're quite active, with tournaments and events throughout the year. But what's really cool is that they also have a chess club for kids, which is a great way to promote the game and encourage young minds.
That's amazing. I was actually of the Burundian Cycling Federation. They have a strong focus on promoting cycling as a sport and a mode of transportation. And they even have a women's cycling team. I'm sure our listeners in Burundi would agree that cycling is a great way to explore the country's beautiful scenery.
Absolutely. And speaking of beautiful scenery, Chile is home to some of the most stunning landscapes in the world. From the Atacama Desert to the Patagonia region, there's no shortage of natural wonders to explore. And did you know that Chile has a thriving community of stargazers? They have some of the darkest skies in the world, making it the perfect spot for stargazing.
Well, that's incredible. I had no idea Chile was a stargazer's paradise. I think our listeners would love to know more about the astronomy clubs in Chile. Perhaps we can discuss the Chilean Association of Astronomy and the various events they host throughout the year.
That's a great idea. Mira, and while we're on the topic of astronomy, I have to ask, have you ever heard of the Burundian Association of Amateur Radio Operators? They're a group of enthusiasts who use radio communication to stay in touch with each other and with people around the world.
Actually, yes. I was reaching out to them to learn more about their activities. It's fascinating to see how people in Burundi are using technology to connect with others and share their interests.
Exactly. And speaking of technology, Chile has a thriving tech industry, with many startups and innovation hubs throughout the country. I'm sure our listeners would be interested in learning more about the Chilean tech scene and the various resources available to entrepreneurs and innovators.
That's a great point. And I think it's worth noting that both Burundi and Chile have a strong focus on community engagement and social responsibility. Whether it's through volunteer work or community-based initiatives, both countries are working to promote social cohesion and development.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that our listeners can really relate to. Whether you're from Burundi or Chile, or from anywhere else in the world, it's clear that community engagement and social responsibility are essential for building strong, vibrant communities.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's episode. I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the information we've shared, and we hope you'll join us for our next comparison podcast. Don't forget to follow the Jet Off our YouTube channel for more episodes like this, and hit that bell icon to catch our videos the moment they drop. We'd love to hear your thoughts and comments below. Reading and responding to them truly brightens our day. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back soon with more.
And remember, if you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, please don't hesitate to let us know. We value your input and look forward to hearing from you. Until next time, adios from Chile and a beat it from Burundi.
Warmest wishes from us, and we'll see you in the next one.